Hello, everyone. Omni-sensei here with What If I Were Reborn in Invincible as Sukuna, the Honored King? Part 5. If you enjoy this kind of content, please hit the like button. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. Don't forget to check out the original story linked in the description. Let's dive into the rise of the Honored King without further ado. Cecil Stedman sat across from Cecil Stedman. The mirrored image was perfect down to the last detail. Same thinning hair, same wire-rimmed glasses, same perpetually exhausted expression that came from decades of managing superhuman crises. The only difference was the subtle hardness in the eyes of the Cecil from the original timeline, a man who had witnessed the betrayal of Earth's greatest hero and the slaughter of the Guardians of the Globe. So original canon Cecil began, his fingers steepled before him. In your version of events, Nolan never killed the Guardians. No, altered, fanfic Cecil confirmed, leaning back in his chair. Thanks to Sukuna's intervention. They sat in a secure conference room deep within the merged GDA headquarters, a strange architectural hybrid that somehow incorporated elements from both their original facilities, creating a building that felt simultaneously familiar and alien to both men. And you trust him? Original Cecil asked, skepticism evident in his voice, after knowing what he was sent here to do. Altered Cecil adjusted his glasses. Trust is a strong word. Let's say I recognize the strategic value of his cooperation, especially with the Viltrumite Empire's imminent arrival. Original Cecil's expression darkened. In my experience, Nolan nearly killed Mark before fleeing Earth. He's been off-world for months. Interesting divergence point, Altered Cecil noted. In my experience, Sukuna confronted Nolan in the Flaxen dimension, forcing him to reconsider his mission. The battle between them was significant. This Sukuna, Original Cecil said, pulling up footage of the four-armed being on a nearby screen. He's not in our records. No equivalent exists in our history. A unique variable, Altered Cecil agreed. His presence appears to be the primary divergence between our timelines. The door opened, admitting both versions of Mark and Eve, along with Sukuna, Nolan, and Urom. The tension in the room immediately spiked as Original Mark's eyes locked onto Nolan. I still don't understand why he's here, Original Mark said through gritted teeth. Because we need every resource available, Original Cecil replied, his tone making it clear the decision wasn't up for debate. If dimensional barriers are collapsing across the multiverse, we can't afford to indulge personal grudges. Personal grudges? Original Mark repeated incredulously. He murdered the Guardians. He tried to kill me. He was still too incredibly traumatized to even contemplate truly trusting his father again, another version of him or not. In your experience, Altered Mark interjected, stepping between his counterpart and his father. In mine, he didn't. Because of Megumi. Original Mark turned his glare to Sukuna. Right. The mysterious four-armed guy who supposedly stopped Omni-Man. Forgive me if I still find that hard to believe. Your disbelief changes nothing, Sukuna replied, his eyes regarding Original Mark with detached interest. Facts remain facts regardless of your emotional response to them. Everyone please, Altered Cecil interrupted, raising a hand. We have more pressing concerns than historical discrepancies. He gestured to the main display, which showed a map of the merged city with dozens of glowing green points indicating dimensional anomalies. We're detecting new incursions every few minutes. Most appear to be confused civilians or alternate versions of known individuals, but some are hostile. Define hostile, Altered Eve asked, moving closer to examine the data. We have reports of at least 3 alternate Invincibles attacking civilians in different parts of the city, Original Cecil explained, along with what appears to be a version of Battle Beast rampaging through the financial district. Another Battle Beast, Altered Mark groaned. We just finished dealing with one. Actually, I finished dealing with him, Sukuna corrected, his tone matter-of-fact rather than boastful. Original Cecil's eyes narrowed slightly. You defeated Battle Beast? Alone? Yes, Sukuna confirmed simply. Original Cecil exchanged a glance with his counterpart, clearly reassessing the four-armed being's capabilities. There's more, Altered Cecil continued, changing the display to show surveillance footage from downtown. We're picking up energy signatures unlike anything we've encountered before. 3 distinct sources, all sharing certain characteristics with Sukuna's energy pattern, but each with unique variations. The footage showed 3 figures moving through the chaos of the merged city. Each appeared humanoid, but with distinctive characteristics that set them apart from normal humans. The first moved with predatory grace through a shopping district, his eyes scanning the surroundings with cold interest as civilians fled in terror. Though he appeared mostly human, there was something fundamentally wrong about his presence, as if reality itself rejected him. The second strode confidently down a main boulevard, forearms casually swinging at his sides, his traditional Japanese clothing marking him as clearly out of place in the modern setting. Buildings crumbled in his wake, not from any visible attack but simply from proximity to his overwhelming presence. The third moved more deliberately, studying his surroundings with analytical precision. This version appeared as a young man with haunted eyes and a face that seemed too burdened for its years. Though his body was clearly different from the others, leaner, with messy black hair falling across his forehead, the presence within was unmistakable. He too had a normal set of arms much like the first one and wore modern clothing. But what was most noticeable about him was his more controlled demeanor, suggesting a different temperament from the others. There was something particularly unsettling about this version, a cold calculation behind those dark red eyes that promised methodical destruction rather than chaotic violence. Sukuna stared at this third version longer than the others, his 4 eyes narrowing in what might have been recognition or concern. Yutaro Katsu, he murmured in his mind, the name falling from his lips with a weight that suggested significant history. He found a way to possess him after all. Sukuna himself wished to possess the body of Yuta rather than Megumi as well, for the special grade could copy all cursed techniques, the 10 shadows as well. But Sukuna could not find a way to work away the fact the boy was unsuited in body for his soul's poisonous strength. Apparently, this version of himself somehow managed to find a workaround. What are they? Original Mark asked, staring at the footage with growing concern. They're me, Sukuna replied, his 4 eyes narrowing as he studied the images. Or rather, versions of me from different timelines. There are more of you? Original Eve asked, unable to keep the alarm from her voice. Stupid question, she later thought in her mind, since with there being more versions of Mark and herself, more of others is a logical conclusion, but when it comes to a guy capable of subduing Omni-Man, the peak of strength in both Mark's and her eyes, with them having to face 3 of them, the thought was terrifying. It appears so, Sukuna confirmed, though each seems to represent a different point in my evolution. Altered Eve moved closer to the display, her curiosity evident despite the seriousness of the situation. The energy signatures are similar but distinct, like different stages of the same fundamental force. This complicates matters, Nolan observed, speaking for the first time since entering the room. If these versions have even a fraction of Sukuna's capabilities, then they're immense threats. Both Marks exchanged glances, a shared thought passing between them despite their differences. I need to check on my mom, they said in unison, then stared at each other in surprise. I should come with you, Nolan said, rising from his seat. Debbie might be no, Original Mark said firmly, placing a hand against Nolan's chest to stop him. There are probably 2 versions of my mom now, and you can do whatever you want with your wife, but you stay away from my mom. Don't speak to her. Don't even be in the same room as her. She's dealt with enough grief because of you. A flash of pain crossed Nolan's face before he quickly masked it with a neutral expression. I understand, he said quietly, stepping back. Altered Mark looked between them uncomfortably. We should go, he said to his counterpart. The sooner we make sure they're safe, the sooner we can deal with everything else. As the 2 Marks prepared to leave, Nolan nodded once to his son, the one from his timeline, before turning away, his shoulders carrying a weight that hadn't been there moments before. Sukuna's attention remained fixed on the display, particularly on the image of the version possessing Itadori Yuji. I'm going to handle that one, he stated, the decision already made. I'm coming with you, altered Eve. I'll get things ready, Sukuna-sama. And Yuram stated at the same time, immediately, moving to his side. Sukuna shook his head. No. This is something I must do alone. His tone brooking no argument. But Eve began, while Yuram herself retreated, understanding when her master has made up his mind. You should test your new capabilities, he interrupted, his tone softening slightly as he regarded her. Discover your limits before engaging in combat. It would be tactically advantageous. Eve hesitated, clearly wanting to argue but recognizing the logic in his words. Fine, she conceded reluctantly. But be careful. Sukuna's lips curved in a slight smile. Always. While as he left, he gently put his hand on Yuram's head and ruffled her hair slightly, causing her eyes to widen in surprise as she looked up, but Sukuna had already passed her. As he walked toward the door, his thoughts turned to the vessel his alternate self had chosen, Itadori Yuji, the boy whose very existence he had once despised with every fiber of his being. Now, confronted with the possibility of facing him directly, Sukuna found his feelings unexpectedly complicated. He didn't know what he wanted from this encounter, but he knew he needed to face this version of himself. To speak with the boy. And ultimately, to destroy his other self. After all, the heavens and earth were too small to contain more than one king. In a warehouse on the outskirts of the merged city, 6 figures sat in uncomfortable silence. Each wore some variation of the Invincible costume, yet each was fundamentally different from the others in ways that went far beyond their attire. Sinister Mark leaned against a support beam, his dark costume with its black accents where the original had blue reflecting his corrupted soul. A cape hung from his shoulders, an affectation he'd adopted after taking control of his world's superhero community through systematic elimination of anyone who opposed him. Mohawk Mark paced restlessly, his spiked hair and modified costume with torn sleeves and added spikes projecting the rebellious image he cultivated. His fingers tapped against his thigh in an impatient rhythm, betraying his growing boredom. Viltrumite Mark sat rigidly in a chair that seemed too small for his imposing frame. His costume incorporated elements of traditional Viltrumite battle armor, shoulder plates, bracers, and a modified chest emblem that resembled the Viltrumite Empire's insignia. Unmasked Mark stood by the window, staring out at the city with an expression of quiet longing. True to his name, he wore no mask, his face exposed to the world. His costume was simpler than the others, almost minimalist, as if the trappings of heroism were an afterthought to him now. Dark Mark sat hunched in a corner, his costume a muted version of the original, all bright colors replaced with shades of gray and black. A hood partially obscured his face, casting shadows that matched the darkness in his eyes. Astronaut Mark studied a map of the city spread across a table, his costume modified with elements of space gear, reinforced plating, life support connections, and a subtle alien influence in the design that hinted at his time with the Flaxen Empire. So, Mohawk Mark broke the silence, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Anyone else wondering why we're sitting around in this dump instead of blowing up Midtown like we're supposed to? Astronaut Mark looked up from his map. Because we're not stupid, he replied evenly. Something feels wrong about all this. The dimensional fluctuations are increasing exponentially. This isn't what Levy described would happen. Exactly, Viltrumite Mark agreed, his deep voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding armies. It's the same reason as you. We didn't get to our positions by rushing blindly into chaos. Mohawk Mark snorted. Speak for yourself. I'm here because the pay was good and the promise of unlimited worlds to conquer sounded fun. He kicked at a crate, sending it skidding across the floor. Now we're just sitting around while reality itself gets a makeover. Patience, Sinister Mark advised, his cold voice carrying an undercurrent of amusement. The board is being reset. New pieces are entering play. We should understand the game before making our move. Always with the chess metaphors, Mohawk Mark rolled his eyes. Some of us just want to flip the board and be done with it. Dark Mark spoke up, his voice heavy with emotion. We all had our reasons for joining Levy. Mine hasn't changed, regardless of what's happening to the dimensions. And what's that, exactly? Astronaut Mark asked. though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Dark Mark's eyes took on a haunted quality. I just want to see my mom again. Mohawk Mark burst into cruel laughter. Still crying about mommy? That's pathetic, even for you. Dark Mark's fists clenched, but he didn't rise to the bait. You wouldn't understand. You didn't watch her die. No, I killed mine, Sinister Mark said casually, examining his gloves with disturbing detachment. It was surprisingly easy. Just like killing Cecil. And Robot. And everyone else who got in my way. An uncomfortable silence fell over the group. What about the rest of you? Astronaut Mark asked, deliberately changing the subject. Why side with Levy? What's your endgame here? Viltrumite Mark straightened, his pride evident in every movement. The conquest of all realities under Viltrumite rule. My father was weak, hesitating when he should have acted. I showed no such weakness when I took his place. How original, Mohawk Mark mocked. Another Viltrumite wanting to rule everything. Never heard that one before. And your goal is what? Chaos for its own sake. Viltrumite Mark countered, eyes narrowing. Mohawk Mark grinned, the expression more feral than amused. Freedom. Pure and simple. No rules, no responsibilities. No Cecil Stedman telling me what I can and can't do. Just the power to go wherever I want, take whatever I want, do whatever I want. You sound like a child, Astronaut Mark observed. And you sound like a bore, Mohawk Mark shot back. What's your story anyway, Space Boy? Levy didn't share much about your timeline. Astronaut Mark's expression darkened. The Flaxans captured me during their third invasion. They have different perceptions of time. What was months for Earth was decades for me. I was remade in their image, trained in their ways of war. When I returned, everything I knew was gone. So you're helping Levy because... Dark Mark prompted. Because he promised me a world where the Flaxans never invaded. Where I never lost everything. His voice took on a harder edge. And if that doesn't work out, I have an army waiting for my signal to begin conquest across multiple dimensions. Unmasked Mark, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. I miss Megumi. The simple statement drew all eyes to him. Who? Mohawk Mark asked, genuinely confused. Unmasked Mark turned from the window, his expression a complex mixture of grief and longing. Megumi Fushiguro. In my world, he was my best friend. The only one who truly stood by me, not out of fear or reverence, but because he genuinely believed the world could be better with us together. Never heard of him, Sinister Mark said dismissively. He was different, Unmasked Mark continued, ignoring the interruption. Not because of powers or abilities, he had none, but because of his mind, his way of seeing the world. He understood strategy, human nature, the long game in ways no one else did. He always knew exactly what to say, exactly how to approach a problem. What happened to him? Dark Mark asked softly, recognizing the pain of loss in Unmasked Mark's voice. Unmasked Mark's expression hardened. My father killed him. To prove a point about humans having too much influence over me. Said no human should have that kind of bond with a Viltrumite. His fists clenched at the memory. So I killed my father. Then I killed Thrag and took control of the Viltrum Empire. You killed Thrag? Viltrumite Mark asked, unable to keep the surprise from his voice. With strategies Megumi had helped me develop before he died, Unmasked Mark confirmed. He showed me how to think differently, how to approach combat in ways Viltrumites never considered, how to get stronger, how to use their arrogance and predictability against them. So what's your endgame with Levy? Astronaut Mark asked. Revenge on all versions of your father. Unmasked Mark shook his head. I want to find this world's Megumi. Bring him back with me. Have him at my side again so we can make all realities better, like we always planned. Mohawk Mark snickered. That's the gayest thing I've ever heard. The armrest of Unmasked Mark's chair shattered in his grip. In a blur of motion too fast for even the other marks to fully track, he hurled the broken piece directly at Mohawk Mark's face. Mohawk Mark barely managed to dodge, the projectile embedding itself in the wall behind him with enough force to crack the concrete. "Say that again," Unmasked Mark challenged, his voice deadly quiet. "Please." Mohawk Mark raised his hands in mock surrender, though his smirk remained. "Touched a nerve, did I? You have no idea what it's like to have someone who truly understands you, who sees the world the same way you do," Unmasked Mark said, his voice tight with emotion. "Someone who makes you better just by existing. And then to have that ripped away." An uncomfortable silence fell over the group. Has anyone actually seen this Megumi guy in this timeline? Dark Mark finally asked, partly to defuse the tension. Astronaut Mark shook his head. "I've been monitoring local hero activity since we arrived. No mention of anyone by that name." "He could be operating under a different identity," Unmasked Mark suggested. "Or maybe he's keeping a low profile in this world. Or maybe he doesn't exist here at all," Sinister Mark pointed out cruelly. "Not all timelines have the same players." Unmasked Mark's expression darkened. "He exists. I can feel it." "Speaking of feeling things," Viltrumite Mark interrupted, his head tilting slightly as if listening to something distant. "Anyone else sense that?" The others paused, their enhanced Viltrumite senses picking up what ordinary humans couldn't: a subtle vibration in the air, a disturbance in the fabric of reality itself. "Something's happening," Astronaut Mark confirmed, moving to the window. "The dimensional fluctuations are intensifying." Outside, the sky had taken on a strange rippling quality, as if reality itself was becoming fluid. Green energy pulsed across the horizon in waves, each one stronger than the last. "Maybe our time to act is getting closer than we think," Sinister Mark stated with a smile. Astronaut Mark shook his head, his expression grim as he studied the rippling sky. "No. This is different. The dimensional barriers aren't just weakening, they're collapsing entirely." He turned back to the group, his tactical mind already calculating possibilities. Levy's plan was to use controlled dimensional breaches to allow us to operate in this world, then return to our own realities once we completed our objectives. This. He gestured toward the window. "This is uncontrolled. Chaotic." "So what?" Mohawk Mark challenged, though there was a hint of unease beneath his bravado. "More chaos means more opportunities." "It means we might not have realities to return to," Astronaut Mark countered. "The dimensional merger is accelerating. I've seen something like this before, during my time with the Flaxons. When multiple timelines begin to collapse into one another, duplicates can't coexist indefinitely." Viltrumite Mark rose from his chair, his imposing frame casting a shadow across the warehouse floor. "Explain." "The universe abhors redundancy," Astronaut Mark said, his voice taking on a lecturing tone. "Two versions of the same person can't exist in the same reality for long. Eventually, the timeline will correct itself." "By doing what, exactly?" Dark Mark asked, pulling his hood further over his face as if to hide from the implications. "By eliminating the duplicates," Astronaut Mark replied simply. "Or merging them. Either way, only one version of each person will remain when this is over." A heavy silence fell over the group as they processed this information. "And who decides which version survives?" Sinister Mark asked, his cold eyes calculating. "Usually the version native to the dominant reality," Astronaut Mark explained. "But with this level of dimensional instability, it could be random. Or it could be determined by strength of will, physical power, or some other factor we don't understand." Unmasked Mark turned back to the window, watching as the green energy waves grew more intense. "So we're fighting for our very existence now." "It would appear so," Astronaut Mark confirmed. Mohawk Mark kicked another crate, his frustration evident. "Great. So Levy drags us into this mess, promising unlimited worlds to conquer, and now we might not even exist tomorrow. Fantastic plan." "We need to adapt," Viltrumite Mark stated, his military mind already shifting to contingency planning. If only one version of each of us can survive, we need to ensure it's one of us, not this world's Mark Grayson. How do we do that? Dark Mark asked. We eliminate him, Sinister Mark suggested, a cruel smile playing across his lips. Remove the competition. That might not work, Astronaut Mark cautioned. The merger appears to be operating on a metaphysical level. Killing this world's Mark might simply cause one of us to transform into his replacement, losing our own identity in the process. Then what do you suggest? Viltrumite Mark demanded. Astronaut Mark was silent for a moment, considering their options. We need leverage. Something that gives us an advantage in this merger process. Like what? Mohawk Mark scoffed. A dimensional anchor? A reality stabilizer? This isn't one of your sci-fi flaxen technologies. No, Astronaut Mark agreed. But there might be something else. He turned to Unmasked Mark. You said this Megumi person helped you defeat Thrag. That he understood strategy in ways others didn't. Unmasked Mark nodded, a flicker of hope entering his eyes. Yes. He could see patterns others missed, anticipate moves before they were made. Then finding him might be our best option, Astronaut Mark concluded. If he exists in this reality, he might understand what's happening better than we do. You want to pin our survival on some random human? Viltrumite Mark asked incredulously. He created a plan to make one of us kill Thrag and conquer Viltrum uncontested. That requires absurd amounts of intelligence and creativity. Astronaut Mark countered. And he's not random, Unmasked Mark corrected, his voice taking on a hard edge. He's Megumi Fushiguro, the most brilliant mind I've ever encountered. Fine, Sinister Mark interjected, pushing away from the support beam. Let's say we try to find this Megumi person. Where do we even start looking? Unmasked Mark considered this. In my world, he was a high school student at Reginald Vell Johnson High, the same school as Mark Grayson. Then that's where we start, Astronaut Mark decided. We find this Megumi and convince him to help us. And how exactly do we do that? Mohawk Mark scoffed, gesturing toward the window where the rippling green sky cast an eerie glow over the chaos outside. The world has gone to shit. Dimensional rifts are opening everywhere. People are panicking in the streets. What kind of ridiculous idea is infiltrating a school? There probably isn't even school in this apocalypse. Astronaut Mark frowned, acknowledging the point. Fair assessment. Educational institutions would likely be suspended during a dimensional crisis of this magnitude. If he's anything like the Megumi I knew, Unmasked Mark interjected, he wouldn't be sitting in a classroom anyway. Not with everything falling apart outside. Then where would he be? Dark Mark asked. Unmasked Mark considered this, drawing on his memories. Somewhere strategic. Somewhere he could observe, analyze, and plan. My Megumi always positioned himself to gather maximum information with minimum exposure. The Global Defense Agency, Viltrumite Mark suggested. If he's as tactically minded as you claim, he might have found his way there. Or he could be working with this world's heroes, Astronaut Mark added. The Guardians of the Globe or the Team. Or he could be dead, Sinister Mark pointed out coldly. Dimensional collapses aren't exactly conducive to survival for ordinary humans. Unmasked Mark's expression hardened. He's alive. And we're going to find him. Split up, Astronaut Mark decided. Cover more ground. Dark Mark and Unmasked Mark, check the GDA headquarters. Viltrumite Mark, scout the known hero bases. Mohawk Mark and Sinister Mark, search the emergency shelters and medical centers. I'll monitor the dimensional fluctuations from here and coordinate our efforts. What kind of shitty names are those? I know we all have the same name, but come on. Mohawk Mark protested. I like it, Sinister Mark, has a nice ring to it. Sinister Mark stated. And if we find him? Dark Mark asked, ignoring the two. We bring him here, Unmasked Mark replied. I'll convince him to help us. He'll understand the stakes. As the group dispersed to prepare for their respective missions, unmasked Mark remained by the window, watching the increasingly unstable sky. His thoughts turned to memories of his Megumi, the quiet confidence, the strategic mind, the unwavering loyalty. "I'll find you," he whispered to the empty air. "Wherever you are in this world, I'll find you." The sky above the devastated shopping district rippled with emerald energy as Sukuna descended, his four arms held slightly away from his body for balance. He landed with deliberate precision on the cracked pavement, creating a small crater from the impact. Before him stood a figure that was simultaneously familiar and foreign, a young man with distinctive pink hair and slitted eyes that gleamed with malevolence. Though the body was that of Yuji Itadori, the presence controlling it was unmistakable. Sukuna, the four-armed being acknowledged a courtesy, since he himself has long gotten used to the name Megumi, his multiple eyes assessing the vessel before him. The pink-haired youth's lips curved into a contemptuous smile, his eyes narrowing as he studied his counterpart. "What is this?" he asked, his voice dripping with disdain. "Some pathetic imitation dares to wear my face." "Not an imitation," Sukuna replied evenly. "Another iteration. From this world." Shibuya Sukuna circled slowly, examining the four-armed figure with theatrical disgust. "This world must be truly pitiful if this is what passes for me." He gestured dismissively. "Look at you. For arms yet no presence. Multiple eyes yet blind to your own degradation." The shopping district around them lay in ruins, evidence of Shibuya Sukuna's brief but devastating presence in this reality. Storefronts had been sliced apart with surgical precision, concrete pillars bisected by invisible blades, and the scattered remains of those unfortunate enough to cross his path lay in meticulously arranged pieces, a grotesque display of artistry in death. "I see you've been entertaining yourself," Sukuna observed, glancing at the carnage with detached assessment. "Merely stretching my legs after being confined for so long," Shibuya Sukuna replied, casually stepping over a severed limb. "This vessel fought admirably, but the dimensional transition weakened him. Finally, I have what is rightfully mine." "Release your hold on Yuji Itadori," Sukuna commanded, his voice resonating with authority. Shibuya Sukuna's laughter echoed through the ruined shopping district, sharp and mocking. "Ha! You're giving me orders? How amusing." He wiped an imaginary tear from his eye. "Why would I relinquish what I've claimed? This flesh is mine by right of conquest." "You forced his soul to bear the brunt of the dimensional transition," Sukuna stated, weakening him enough to finally chain and control him. "Relinquish that control." "Or what?" Shibuya Sukuna challenged, his smile turning predatory. "You'll fight me? Please. I can sense your nature from here." His expression twisted with revulsion. "You reek of humanity. Of compromise. Of weakness. Whatever version of me you are, you've fallen so far you might as well be human." Sukuna's four eyes narrowed slightly, but his expression remained controlled. "I see you still cling to the delusion that isolation equals strength. That purposeless cruelty equals power." "Delusion." Shibuya Sukuna scoffed. "It is the natural order. The strong devour the weak. I am Ryaman Sukuna, the king of curses. My dominion is absolute." "A king without subjects rules nothing," Sukuna countered. "A king without purpose is merely a tyrant with a title." "Purpose." Shibuya Sukuna's face contorted with disdain. What purpose does a god need beyond his own satisfaction? What meaning exists beyond power itself? Sukuna regarded him with something almost like pity. "You still don't understand. After all these years, you remain blind to the most fundamental truth." "And what truth would that be?" Shibuya Sukuna sneered. "That true strength lies not in what you can destroy," Sukuna stated, "but in what you choose to preserve. Not in how many fear you, but in what you're willing to protect." Shibuya Sukuna's expression shifted from mockery to genuine disgust. "You sound like that insufferable Gojo. Or worse, like the vessel itself." He spat on the ground. "I can't believe you're a version of me. You're soft." "I am still the king of curses," Sukuna declared, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. But a king evolves or becomes obsolete. A king adapts or is overthrown. You have remained static, trapped in the same patterns of thought for centuries. Evolution? Adaptation. Shibuya Sukuna laughed bitterly. You mean surrender, compromise, weakness. I have not surrendered, Sukuna replied, his forearms tensing slightly. I have transcended. Where you see only destruction, I see potential. Where you see only domination, I see connection. Where you see only consumption, I see growth. Poetic nonsense, Shibuya Sukuna dismissed. If you were truly me, you would understand that power is its own justification. That strength needs no purpose beyond itself. I was you, Sukuna acknowledged. Arrogant, isolated, convinced of my own superiority. But I have become more. More. Shibuya Sukuna's voice dripped with contempt. You've become less. A shadow of true greatness. A domesticated beast who's forgotten his fangs. My fangs remain, Sukuna stated coldly. I simply choose when to bear them. Then bear them now, Shibuya Sukuna challenged, sliding into a combat stance. Prove you're still worthy of the name Sukuna. I don't need to prove anything to you, Sukuna replied. Especially not to a version of myself still trapped in childish notions of power. Childish. Shibuya Sukuna's rage was palpable, cursed energy swirling around him in violent patterns. I'll show you the difference between your evolution and true power. He lunged forward, fingers extended in the familiar formation for dismantle, the cutting technique that had slaughtered countless sorcerers across centuries. Sukuna didn't dodge. With a single fluid motion enhanced by the smart atoms now integrated into his being, he struck, not at Shibuya Sukuna's physical form, but at the barrier between souls within Yuji's body. His fist connected with Shibuya Sukuna's abdomen with devastating precision, cursed energy bypassing physical defenses to strike directly at the spiritual boundary. The impact sent ripples through both visible and invisible planes of existence. Shibuya Sukuna froze mid-attack, his eyes widening in shock and disbelief. What dash, he gasped, as something fundamental shifted within the vessel he had claimed. What have you done? I've reminded you of your place, Sukuna stated, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority as the king of curses. You are not the master here. You are a parasite, feeding on a strength that was never truly yours. The vessel's body convulsed violently as the barrier between souls shattered. Something dark began to emerge from Yuji's mouth, a finger, blackened and twisted with cursed energy, followed by another and another. Impossible! Shibuya Sukuna snarled, his voice distorting as more fingers forced their way out. No one can break the binding vow. No one can separate me from my vessel. I am not no one, Sukuna replied calmly, watching as the cursed objects were expelled one after another. I am Ryaman Sukuna, the king of curses, the first son of heaven. And unlike you, I understand the true nature of our power, not just how to use it, but why it exists at all. You still speak of purpose as if it matters, Shibuya Sukuna spat, even as his control over Yuji's body weakened with each expelled finger. As if power needs justification beyond itself. Something I refuse to even contemplate. Power without purpose is merely violence, Sukuna stated. Strength without direction is simply destruction. You could have been more than a curse, more than a nightmare whispered in the dark. You could have been a king in truth, not just in name. As the last of the fingers emerged, Shibuya Sukuna's presence began to fade from Yuji's body, coalescing into a spectral form that hovered above the expelled cursed objects. I refuse to accept this. All I see is a king whose hold has become soft, the specter accused, its voice growing fainter as its connection to the physical world weakened. A pale shadow of what we once were. Sukuna stood impassive, unmoved by the accusation. Of course, he replied, his tone matter-of-fact rather than defensive. I've lost, after all. The admission seemed to confuse the fading specter. Lost? What nonsense are you? Its words cut off as the last of its presence was forced out of Yuji's body. The young man's natural eye color returned, his eyes clearing of Sukuna's influence for the first time since the dimensional transition. Yuji blinked, disoriented, as he took in the four-armed figure standing before him and the spectral form hovering nearby. "What happened?" he managed weakly, his voice hoarse. "You're free," Sukuna stated simply. "Temporarily, at least." Yuji's gaze fell to the cursed fingers scattered around him, then back to the four-armed being who had somehow expelled them from his body. "Who are you?" "Someone who understands," Sukuna replied. Better than he ever did. Before Yuji could respond further, his eyes rolled back in his head, his body going limp as exhaustion and the trauma of the forced separation overcame him. He collapsed to the ground, unconscious but free from Sukuna's control for the first time since crossing the dimensional barrier. Sukuna regarded the fallen vessel and the expelled fingers with a contemplative expression. The spectral form of Shibuya Sukuna still hovered nearby, weakened but defiant, tethered to this reality by the cursed objects that contained fragments of his soul. Eventually, they would need to be dealt with. The dimensional merger would not allow duplicates to exist indefinitely, even in this separated state. But for now, they could remain as they were, a reminder of what he had once been, and what he had chosen to become. The King of Curses turned his gaze to the rippling sky above, where green energy continued to pulse with increasing intensity. The merger was accelerating, reality itself becoming more unstable with each passing moment. There was much to be done, and little time remaining. But at least one task had been completed, one piece of himself established as he lifted Yuji's unconscious form from the ground. Sukuna felt the weight of his choices, past, present, and future, settle upon his shoulders like the mantle of the king he still was, despite everything that had changed. A king evolves or becomes obsolete. A king adapts or is overthrown. And he had no intention of being either obsolete or overthrown. The Grayson family home stood as an island of relative normalcy amid the chaos of the dimensional merger. Outside, the sky continued to ripple with emerald energy, casting an eerie glow through the windows of the suburban house. Inside, an unprecedented family reunion was taking place, one that defied everything normal. Two Debbie Graysons sat across from each other at the dining room table, their identical faces reflecting different lives, different experiences, different sorrows. Between them stood two versions of their son, Mark, physically identical yet fundamentally altered by the divergent paths their lives had taken. "It's the strangest thing," Original Debbie said, her hands wrapped tightly around a mug of tea that had long since gone cold. "One minute I was in the kitchen making dinner, the next there was this green flash, and suddenly..." She gestured helplessly toward her counterpart. "We were standing face to face," Altered Debbie finished for her, a gentle smile softening her features. "It seems counterparts are being drawn together as the dimensions merge. According to Cecil, our Cecil, it's happening all across the city." Original Mark nodded, leaning against the kitchen counter with his arms crossed. "Yeah, same thing happened with me. I was just flying around downtown when bam! Suddenly I'm staring at another counterpart of myself with Eve. Then we fought, then we stopped, and now we're here. Talk about a weird day, even by superhero standards." "No kidding," Altered Mark agreed with a half-smile. "Though at this point, I'm starting to think weird is our new normal." Original Debbie studied her alternate self, noting the subtle differences that distinguished them, a certain ease in her bearing, fewer worry lines around her eyes, a warmth that spoke of a life less traumatized. "I still can't believe it," she said quietly. "In your world, Nolan never..." She trailed off, unable to complete the thought. Altered Debbie reached across the table, placing her hand over her counterpart's. "No, he didn't. Thanks to Megumi." "This Megumi person," Original Debbie said, glancing between Altered Mark and his mother. "You mentioned he confronted Nolan? How is that even possible? Nolan was the most powerful being on the planet." Altered Mark's expression softened at the mention of his friend. "Megumi's something else," he explained, his tone warming. "Got these crazy abilities that even Dad couldn't just brush off. But it wasn't just that. Megumi sees through people, you know? Gets them in a way that's kinda scary sometimes. He confronted Dad in the Flaxen dimension," he continued, running a hand through his hair. "Somehow got Dad to actually think about what he was planning to do, what he'd be throwing away if he went through with it. A genuine smile spread across his face. And he did it. Got through Dad's thick Viltrumite skull somehow. Made him choose us. Original Mark let out a disbelieving snort. Yeah, right. My dad nearly beat me to death when I tried to stop him. Killed the Guardians without even blinking. But sure, this Megumi guy just talked him out of it. He couldn't just accept it. He didn't want to accept it. Did just some guy, best friend of his alternate self or not, know his dad better than he did? Got through his dad when even the near-on killing of his son didn't? How can he just take that and go with it? Though deep down, Original Mark realized that he was jealous. Jealous that he didn't have such luck to have some awesome friend who fixed all your problems before they even became ones. Hey, I know how it sounds, Altered Mark shot back, defensive. I wouldn't have believed it either if I hadn't seen the aftermath. But it happened. In our world, the Guardians are still alive. Dad's actually working with them now, helping get Earth ready for when the Viltrumites show up. Original Debbie's hands trembled slightly, causing her tea to slosh in its mug. It's hard to accept that there's a version of my life where everything didn't fall apart, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Where I wasn't lied to for 20 years. Where my husband didn't turn out to be. She couldn't finish, tears welling in her eyes. Altered Debbie squeezed her counterpart's hand. It wasn't perfect, even in our world, she said. When Nolan finally told me the truth, about who he was, why he came to Earth, I was devastated. Betrayed. Furious. But he chose us, Altered Mark jumped in. That's the big difference. When push came to shove, he picked his family over his mission. Picked being human over being a good little Viltrumite soldier. Original Mark pushed himself off the counter, pacing the kitchen with restless energy. Well, good for you guys, he said, unable to keep the bitterness from his voice. My father chose the Empire. He chose his precious duty over everything we had together. And I'm so sorry for that, Altered Debbie told him, her eyes filled with compassion. I can't imagine the pain you've both endured. Original Debbie wiped away a tear, attempting to regain her composure. Tell me about him, she requested suddenly. You're Nolan. After he changed his mind. What is he like now? Altered Debbie's expression grew thoughtful. More honest than he's ever been, she replied after a moment. There's a weight that's been lifted from him, now that he's no longer living a lie. He's more present, more engaged. She smiled faintly, and surprisingly vulnerable, in ways I never saw before. He's still Dad, Altered Mark added with a shrug. Still stubborn as hell, still thinks he knows everything. But he's also, I dunno, more real somehow. Like he finally stopped fighting against his human side and just let himself be both. Original Mark kicked at an invisible spot on the floor, his frustration palpable. And all because of this Megumi guy? One random dude somehow changed the mind of a Viltrumite warrior with centuries of conditioning. Hey, watch it, Altered Mark snapped, his casual demeanor instantly vanishing. Megumi isn't just some random dude. He's the most extraordinary person I've ever known. My best friend. The one person who saw what was coming and had the guts to do something about it. Original Debbie noticed the shift in Altered Mark's tone. You care about him a great deal, she observed. He saved my family, Altered Mark stated firmly. He saved my future. Everything I have, everything I am now, I owe to him. There was an intensity to his words that bordered on possessiveness. Without Megumi, I'd have lost everything, just like. He glanced at his counterpart, then looked away. Just like I did, Original Mark finished for him, his voice tight. An uncomfortable silence fell over the kitchen. This Megumi, Original Debbie said finally, attempting to ease the tension. What's he like? Beyond his abilities, I mean. Altered Mark's expression immediately brightened. He's brilliant. Like, scary smart. Sees things nobody else catches. Has this super dry sense of humor that catches you off guard. A smile played at his lips as he continued. He pretends to be this cool, detached guy, but he cares more than anyone I know. He just shows it differently, you know. He sounds special, Original Debbie said, noticing how animated her alternate son became when discussing his friend. He is, Altered Mark confirmed enthusiastically. Dad tried to blow him off at first. Just some human butting into Viltrumite business. But even Dad couldn't ignore Megumi for long. The guy just gets things. Sees through all the BS. Original Mark had stopped pacing, listening with growing interest despite himself. And now? How does your dad feel about him now? Respects the hell out of him, Altered Mark replied without hesitation. Which is saying something, 'cause Dad doesn't respect many people. They have these intense debates sometimes, about power, responsibility, civilization, all that deep stuff. It's like watching two chess masters going at it. They sound close, Original Debbie observed. Altered Debbie laughed softly. I wouldn't go that far. They respect each other, but there's always this tension between them. Like two alpha predators in the same territory, always keeping an eye on each other. That sounds more like the Nolan I knew, Original Debbie murmured. He's still Viltrumite, Altered Debbie acknowledged. That hasn't changed. But he's also more than that now. He's chosen to be more. Original Mark leaned against the wall, his posture defensive. And you trust him? After knowing what he was sent here to do. Altered Mark met his counterpart's gaze directly. Trust is earned, he said. And he's earning it, day by day. It hasn't been easy, and there are still times when I wonder. He shook his head. But then I remember what Megumi told me. Judge him by his choices, not his origins. By what he does now, not what he was programmed to do. Wise words, Original Debbie said softly. That's Megumi, Altered Mark replied, that fond, protective tone returning. Always cutting through to the heart of things. Original Debbie studied her alternate son's face, recognizing something in his expression that reminded her of how her husband used to look at her. Not romantic, but a fierce, almost possessive devotion. Something Altered Debbie could also see. And they were both correct. Altered Mark, after seeing his original counterpart, seeing the shadows over his original mother's face, her sorrow, his other's bitterness and jealousy, the thought of his own father nearly killing him, the family he would die for, who he loved more than life itself broken, despaired nearly broke him. He couldn't imagine going through all that, didn't want to imagine it, and therefore realizing more than ever all that was prevented because of his best friend made him extremely protective over him. You and Megumi, she began carefully. You seem very close. Altered Mark nodded. As I said, he's my best friend. The one person who really gets what I'm going through, the pressure of these powers, the responsibility, the whole human Viltrumite balancing act. In my world, Original Mark said, that person was Eve. At least for a while. Eve? Altered Mark looked surprised. Eve and I are friends, but nothing like. He trailed off, shaking his head. She and Megumi are actually together now. It's still new, but they're intense. Eve and Megumi? Original Mark echoed, clearly struggling to imagine a relationship between someone he knew well and someone he'd never met, especially a counterpart of his own girlfriend. Makes sense when you think about it, Altered Mark explained with a shrug. They're both super smart, both driven, both see the world in ways most people don't. And they're both. He hesitated, searching for the right word. Focused. When they want something, they go after it like a missile locked on target. They sound well matched, Original Debbie observed. They are, Altered Mark agreed. Though it took them forever to figure it out. Megumi's not exactly Mr. Emotional Openness, and Eve. He chuckled. Well, Eve has her own brand of intensity. The conversation paused as another tremor shook the house, stronger than previous ones. The dimensional energy outside pulsed more violently, casting shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. It's getting worse, Original Mark said, glancing toward the window. Yeah, the merger's speeding up, Altered Mark confirmed, his expression growing serious. Cecil, our Cecil, thinks we're getting to the point where the realities will either become one stable dimension or what? Original Debbie asked when he didn't continue. Or everything goes boom, Altered Mark finished grimly. Total reality collapse. Original Debbie reached for her alternate self's hand, squeezing it tightly. What can we do? Cecil's got the best brains from both our worlds working on it, Altered Debbie assured her. Including Megumi and Eve. If anyone can find a solution, they will. And if they can't? Original Mark pressed. Altered Mark met his counterpart's gaze. Then we deal with whatever comes next together. As a family, weird as this family might be right now. Original Debbie looked between the two versions of her son, then at her alternate self. Despite the strangeness of the situation, despite the apocalyptic energies swirling outside, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Together, she agreed softly. As a family. Suddenly the roof explodes. Both Marks immediately move their mothers and protect the mothers from the collapse. Stand ready for my arrival, worms, a booming voice came from above. As the two looked, they saw a mighty titan of a Viltrumite, with a metal arm, and a scarred face with one blind eye. Conquest has descended from the heavens, ready for battle. The roof of the Grayson family home exploded inward, raining debris throughout the living room. Both Marks moved with identical superhuman speed, shielding their respective mothers from the falling wreckage. Stand ready for my arrival, worms, a booming voice announced from above. Through the newly created skylight descended a massive figure, a Viltrumite even larger than Nolan, with bulging muscles that strained against his pure white costume. One of his arms was mechanical, gleaming with advanced technology far beyond Earth's capabilities. His face bore extensive scarring, with one eye milky white and blind, the other burning with cruel intelligence. Who the hell is that? Altered Mark whispered, positioning himself protectively in front of both Debbies. Original Mark shook his head, equally bewildered. No idea. But definitely Viltrumite. The massive alien landed with enough force to crack the foundation of the house, his weight causing the floorboards to groan in protest. He surveyed the room with casual disdain, his single functioning eye lingering on the two identical Marks. Two half-breeds, he observed, his voice rumbling like distant thunder. How convenient. Who are you? Original Mark demanded, his fists clenched at his sides. The Viltrumite's scarred face twisted into what might have been a smile. I am Conquest, enforcer of the Viltrumite Empire. He cracked his neck casually. And you are traitor's spawn. Without warning, he moved, faster than either Mark could track. His metal fist connected with Original Mark's chest, sending him crashing through 3 walls and out into the yard beyond. Before Altered Mark could react, Conquest's organic hand closed around his throat, lifting him off the ground. Interesting still, despite having confronted it myself earlier, Conquest mused, studying Altered Mark's face as he struggled for air. You look identical, yet your energy signature is slightly different. This variant situation is so fun. Let him go, Altered Debbie shouted, her maternal instinct overriding her fear as she rushed toward the massive alien. Conquest flicked his wrist dismissively, creating an air current that sent her tumbling across the room. Original Debbie caught her counterpart before she could slam into the wall. Mom! Altered Mark gasped, clawing at the fingers around his throat. Pathetic, Conquest sneered. Is this truly the best this world has to offer? The son of Nolan, choking like a common animal. He hurled Altered Mark through the ceiling, sending him arcing high into the sky. Then, with a casual leap, Conquest followed, leaving the two Debbies alone in the ruined house. We need to get out of here, Original Debbie urged, helping her counterpart to her feet. Right now. Altered Debbie nodded shakily. Mark, both Marks. They're Viltrumite, Original Debbie reminded her. They're tough. But we're not, and we'll only distract them if we stay. Outside, Altered Mark had recovered enough to launch himself back into the fight. He intercepted Conquest mid-air as the Viltrumite pursued his counterpart, landing a solid punch to the alien's jaw. That the best you got? Original Mark taunted, following up with a rapid series of strikes. Conquest barely seemed to notice the assault. Amusing, he commented, catching Mark's fist effortlessly. You have spirit, at least. With a single twist, he dislocated Mark's arm, eliciting a scream of pain. Altered Mark rejoined the fight, driving both feet into Conquest's back with enough force to send all three of them plummeting toward the ground. They crashed into a nearby park, the impact creating a crater 30 feet wide. Civilians scattered, screaming in terror as the three superpowered beings emerged from the dust cloud. "You fight well," Conquest acknowledged, brushing dirt from his shoulder. "For children." Both marks attacked simultaneously, coordinating instinctively despite never having fought together before. They circled Conquest, striking from opposite sides, using their speed and flight capabilities to stay mobile. Conquest merely laughed, turning to track their movements with practiced ease. "Is this truly all you can muster? Nolan has trained you poorly." "Shut up about my father," Altered Mark shouted, his dislocated arm hanging uselessly at his side as he continued to fight with his good arm. "Your father," Conquest repeated, catching Original Mark's punch and using his momentum to hurl him into his counterpart. "A traitor and a disgrace to the Empire." Both marks tumbled across the ground, quickly regaining their footing. Blood trickled from various cuts on their faces, but their Viltrumite physiology was already working to heal the damage. "We need a plan," Original Mark muttered. "This guy's on another level." "Hit him harder," Altered Mark suggested, grimacing as he popped his dislocated shoulder back into place. "Works for me." They charged again, this time flying low to the ground before shooting upward at the last moment, catching Conquest with uppercuts that snapped his head back. The Viltrumites staggered slightly, the first sign that their attacks were having any effect at all. "Better," Conquest acknowledged, wiping a trickle of blood from his lip. "But not good enough." He moved with frightening speed, appearing between the two marks before they could react. His metal arm caught Original Mark across the face, sending him spinning through the air. His organic hand seized Altered Mark by the leg, swinging him like a club to bat his counterpart further away. "Did you truly believe you could challenge me?" Conquest asked, genuine curiosity in his voice as he slammed Altered Mark repeatedly into the ground. "I have conquered worlds that would make your nightmares seem pleasant. I have exterminated species whose very existence offended the Empire." He lifted Altered Mark by his costume's collar, studying his battered face. "You are nothing. Less than nothing. A half-breed abomination playing at heroism. Leave my sons alone." The new voice cut through the chaos, followed immediately by a red and white blur that slammed into Conquest with devastating force. The impact sent the scarred Viltrumite skidding backward, releasing his grip on Altered Mark. Nolan Grayson, the Altered Timeline's Omni-Man, hovered protectively in front of his son, his cape billowing in the wind created by his sudden arrival. "Dad!" Altered Mark gasped, relief evident in his voice. "Get your counterpart and go," Nolan ordered, never taking his eyes off Conquest. "Get your mothers somewhere safe." Conquest's scarred face split into a grin that held no humor. "Nolan," he said, his voice almost friendly. "The Empire's most notorious traitor." "Conquest," Nolan acknowledged, his expression grim. "I'd heard rumors you'd been assigned to this sector. I'd hoped they weren't true." "You know this guy?" Altered Mark asked, helping his counterpart back to his feet. "Unfortunately," Nolan confirmed. "He's the Empire's enforcer. When planets resist, they send Conquest to resolve the situation." "Such a diplomatic way of putting it," Conquest laughed. "Tell them, Nolan. Tell your half-breed offspring what I really do." Nolan's jaw tightened. "Mark, go. Now." "No way," both marks replied in unison. "How touching," Conquest observed. "Family solidarity. It would be heartwarming if it weren't so pathetic." He studied Nolan with his single functioning eye. "You know, I was sent here for the anomaly, this dimensional disruption that's caught the Empire's attention. Finding you was just a fortunate coincidence. Thrag will be pleased when I bring back your head." "You can try," Nolan replied coldly. "Oh, I'll do more than try." Conquest launched himself forward, his metal fist leading the way. Nolan met the charge head-on, their collision creating a shockwave that shattered windows for blocks around. The two Viltrumites grappled mid-air, each trying to gain leverage over the other. "You've grown soft, Nolan," Conquest taunted, his mechanical arm whirring as it exerted increasing pressure. All these years playing house with these humans has weakened you. And you're still the same sadistic butcher, Nolan retorted, breaking the clinch with a headbutt that sent Conquest tumbling backward. The enforcer recovered quickly, wiping blood from his nose with an expression of delight. Oh, there's still some fight in you. Excellent. I was worried this would be too easy. They clashed again, moving with such speed that the marks could barely track them. Buildings trembled from the force of their impacts, and sonic booms punctuated the air as they broke the sound barrier repeatedly. We have to help him, Original Mark insisted, watching as his father's counterpart took a devastating blow to the ribs. You're right, Altered Mark agreed. But we need to be smart about this. This guy's not like anything we've faced before. They rejoined the battle, timing their attacks to coincide with Nolan's, creating a three-pronged assault that even Conquest couldn't completely ignore. For a brief moment, it seemed they might be gaining an advantage. Then Conquest's expression shifted from amusement to irritation. Enough of this, he growled, his voice dropping an octave. I have indulged your resistance long enough. He caught Original Mark's punch, twisting his arm until bones cracked. Before Altered Mark could intervene, Conquest's boot connected with his chest, sending him crashing through a nearby office building. Then, with brutal efficiency, he turned his full attention to Nolan. You betrayed everything we stand for, Conquest snarled, driving his fist into Nolan's stomach with enough force to rupture organs. You abandoned your mission, your people, your purpose. Nolan attempted to counter, but Conquest was moving with newfound intensity, each strike precisely targeted to cause maximum damage. And for what? Conquest continued, catching Nolan's arm and wrenching it backward until the shoulder dislocated. For these weak, pathetic creatures? For a woman who will be dust in a century? For a half-breed son who will never truly belong to either world? With a sickening crack, he tore Nolan's arm completely from its socket. Red blood sprayed across the battlefield as Nolan screamed in agony. And no! Both Debbies cried out in unison. They had emerged from the ruined house, drawn by the sounds of the battle. Now they stood frozen in horror at the sight of Nolan's mutilation. Dad! Altered Mark shouted, struggling to free himself from the rubble of the collapsed building. Conquest didn't pause. With methodical cruelty, he seized Nolan's remaining arm. The Empire has opened my eyes, Nolan, he said, almost conversationally. After consuming my counterpart, I've come to know of your betrayal from the other's memories. With another savage twist, he tore off Nolan's second arm, eliciting another scream that echoed across the devastated neighborhood. Stop it! Original Debbie screamed, running toward them despite the danger. Altered Debbie followed, both women driven by the same protective instinct despite knowing they were powerless against such a being. Run! Nolan gasped, his voice hoarse from screaming. Debbie, please, run. Conquest turned toward the approaching women, a smile spreading across his scarred face. Ah, the human pets. 2 of them, how delightful. Shall I show you what happens to those who corrupt Viltrumite bloodlines with sentiment? Leave them alone, Original Mark shouted, launching himself at Conquest despite his broken arm and numerous other injuries. Conquest swatted him aside like an insect, his attention fixed on the Debbies. I think I'll take my time with them, he mused, stepping over Nolan's armless form. Make you watch, Nolan. Show you the consequence of your weakness. He reached toward the women, who had stopped in their tracks, paralyzed by terror. The impact came from nowhere, a streak of red that slammed into Conquest with enough force to send him hurtling away from the Debbies, away from Nolan, away from the marks. The scarred Viltrumite crashed through several buildings before coming to a stop nearly half a mile away, embedded in the side of a bank. Where Conquest had stood moments before, a 4-armed figure hovered a few feet above the ground, his multiple eyes scanning the battlefield with cold calculation. Sukuna, Altered Mark gasped in relief. The King of Curses glanced briefly at the armless Nolan, then at the approaching Debbies, then at the 2 battered marks. His expression revealed nothing of his thoughts. Get them out of here, he commanded, his voice carrying that unmistakable authority. All of them. Now. Before either Mark could respond, a sonic boom announced Conquest's return. The Viltrumite enforcer shot through the air, his face contorted with rage as he barreled towards Sukuna. "You dare!" Conquest roared, his metal fist cocked back for a devastating strike. Sukuna met the charge head-on, his own momentum carrying him away from the civilians as he collided with Conquest. The impact created a shockwave that flattened trees and shattered remaining windows for blocks around. "Go!" Sukuna shouted over his shoulder as he grappled with the Viltrumite. "Take the women and go." The two titans crashed into the ground hundreds of meters away, creating a crater that swallowed half a city block. They emerged from the dust cloud locked in combat, Conquest's metal fist driving toward Sukuna's face with enough force to shatter mountains. Sukuna caught the fist with one of his four hands, cursed energy swirling around the point of contact. Conquest's scarred face split into a grin. "Perfect," he whispered. From his mechanical fist, dozens of tiny needles suddenly extended, piercing Sukuna's palm and injecting their contents directly into his bloodstream. The King of Curse's eyes widened in shock as he felt something cold spreading through his veins, disrupting his cursed energy flow. Taking advantage of Sukuna's momentary surprise, Conquest lunged forward, his mouth opening impossibly wide to reveal filed teeth that gleamed with some viscous substance. Before Sukuna could disengage, those teeth sank into his neck, injecting another dose of whatever compound the needles had delivered. Sukuna broke away, putting distance between himself and the Viltrumite. His hand went to his neck, coming away stained with his own blood. More concerning than the physical wound was the sensation coursing through him, a disruption of his cursed energy unlike anything he'd experienced before. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice steady despite the alarm he felt. "What have you done?" Conquest laughed, wiping Sukuna's blood from his lips with evident satisfaction. "Surprised? Did you think that these last few days the universe has been twiddling their thumbs?" He began circling Sukuna, studying him with the calculating eye of a predator. "We studied where the anomaly came from and found the heart of it to be this blue mud ball. We accessed its records and saw you kill Battle Beast, and boy oh boy did that get our king excited." Sukuna attempted to activate his reversed curse technique to neutralize whatever poison was spreading through his system, only to find the healing energy sluggish and unresponsive. "Me too as well, can't deny that." Conquest continued, clearly enjoying Sukuna's confusion. "I've always wanted to have my go at the furball, but orders are orders, and the cat was strong. It was no guarantee that either of us would survive, and Viltrum is already too low on manpower to risk one of their mightiest." He shrugged, the motion incongruously casual given the circumstances. "Though let me not digress. We studied you, boy. We sampled your blood. We found out that you truly are an evolution of this species, one already so compatible with our race. It's got many of our women riled up and ready to have their way with you." Sukuna's four eyes narrowed as he processed this information. The Viltrumites had been monitoring him, studying him, and somehow they developed a compound specifically designed to counter his abilities. It was similar to the energy-disrupting daggers Battle Beast had, but far more potent. "We can't clone you though, sadly," Conquest continued, his tone almost conversational. "Your DNA is too volatile. Probably something to do with your spiritual side." He lunged forward suddenly, forcing Sukuna to block a punch that would have taken his head off. The impact sent shockwaves through the area, threatening to collapse already damaged buildings where civilians might still be trapped. "See, our kind has always had one weakness and one only: magic," Conquest explained, pressing his attack with increasing ferocity. "Magic and the spiritual have always been something we studied, but it could only get us so far because of us not having any natural aptitude for it." Sukuna found himself on the defensive, blocking rather than counterattacking. Each impact threatened to create deadly shockwaves that would endanger anyone still in the vicinity. He needed to move this fight away from Debbie and the others who still weren't far enough away, but Conquest seemed to anticipate his intention. "You are our chance to finally rid ourselves of this weakness," Conquest declared, his single eye gleaming with fanatical light. Every time Sukuna attempted to gain altitude, to carry their battle away from the city, Conquest countered, forcing him back toward the ground. It was a deliberate strategy, Sukuna realized, using the threat to civilians to limit his options. "Take the women and go." Sukuna roared toward the marks, who were still hesitating near their mothers and the fallen Nolan. Get them out of here now. Conquest took advantage of his momentary distraction, delivering a devastating headbutt that sent Sukuna crashing into the earth, creating yet another crater in the already devastated landscape. Going somewhere? The Viltrumite enforcer asked, landing beside the impact site. We're just getting started. Before Sukuna could rise, Conquest was on him, pinning him with his massive weight. His metal hand seized one of Sukuna's arms, wrenching it with methodical precision until the joint separated. You know, I was so lonely, Conquest said conversationally, as if they were sharing drinks rather than engaged in mortal combat. So lonely until a few days ago. With a savage twist, he tore the arm completely free, tossing it aside like garbage. Blood sprayed across both of them as Sukuna roared in pain. All the Viltrumites are scared of me, Conquest continued, seizing a second arm. No one talked to me. No one wanted to be my friend. Everyone thinks I'm unstable. Another twist, another separation of flesh and bone. Another arm discarded. They send me from planet to planet, committing atrocities in their name. And as I got better at it, they feared me more and more. I am a victim of my own success. Conquest's face was inches from Sukuna's now, his expression a disturbing mixture of rage and something almost like tenderness. Tears gathered in his single functioning eye. Conquest, I don't even get a name of my own. Only a purpose. His voice caught, a sob escaping his massive frame. But that changed yesterday, and I feel somehow that it is because of you. The tears flowed freely now, tracking clean lines through the blood and dirt on Conquest's scarred face as he continued to rain blows down on Sukuna's body. I finally met another version of myself, he explained between punches. We talked, we fought, we ate each other, till finally I was the one who remained, but during that time I was truly not alone, understood, all thanks to you. He seized Sukuna by the face, lifting him from the crater. With a burst of speed that broke the sound barrier, Conquest flew upward, dragging Sukuna through the air. All of this, the dimensional merger, the barriers breaking down, it allowed me to find myself, Conquest continued, his voice carrying despite the roaring wind. To truly know myself, by consuming myself. They streaked across the sky, crossing continents in seconds. Mountains appeared below them, then oceans, then more mountains. Conquest never slowed, dragging Sukuna's battered form through the atmosphere with single-minded purpose. I'm sorry, Conquest said suddenly, his tone shifting to something almost gentle as they approached a massive mountain range. My heart aches for you. I wanted to fight you at your full strength, but orders are orders. You're too strong to play with. With devastating force, he drove Sukuna into the side of a mountain, burying him deep within the rock face. I'm sorry, he repeated, the words a strange mantra as he continued his assault. I want you to know that I am grateful to you. He seized Sukuna's shoulder with his teeth, tearing away a chunk of flesh and swallowing it. Your power will become part of me, he said, blood, both his and Sukuna's, dripping from his chin. Just as my counterpart became part of me. It's beautiful, really. The ultimate communion. Deep within Sukuna, something shifted. The poison flowing through his veins had disrupted his cursed energy, weakened his connection to his techniques, but it couldn't sever it completely. He was Ryaman Sukuna, the king of curses, the first son of heaven. His power was not merely physical, not merely spiritual, but a fundamental part of his very existence. With a roar that shook the mountain to its foundations, Sukuna unleashed a wave of cursed energy that sent Conquest tumbling backward. The Viltrumite crashed through several peaks before regaining control, hovering in midair with an expression of surprise that quickly transformed into delight. Yes, he shouted, his voice echoing across the mountain range. Fight back. Make this worthy of remembrance. Sukuna emerged from the shattered mountainside, his remaining arms glowing with cursed energy. The wounds where his other arms had been were sealed with that same energy, preventing further blood loss. His 4 eyes burned with cold fury. You talk too much, he stated simply. Then he moved, crossing the distance between them faster than even Conquest could track. His fist connected with the Viltrumite's jaw with enough force to send him hurtling into the sky. Sukuna followed, propelling himself upward. They clashed again at the edge of the atmosphere, the impact creating a flash visible from the ground below. Conquest laughed wildly as they traded blows, each impact powerful enough to shatter bones had either of them been normal beings. "This is what I wanted." Conquest exulted, blood spraying from his mouth as Sukuna landed a particularly devastating strike. A true challenge. A worthy opponent. "You're insane," Sukuna observed coolly, dodging a punch that would have taken his head off. "Sanity is overrated," Conquest replied, catching Sukuna with a kick that sent him plummeting back toward Earth. "Especially for those of us created solely for destruction." They crashed back through the atmosphere, their bodies heating to temperatures that would have incinerated lesser beings. The battle carried them across continents, through oceans, leaving devastation in their wake. Cities flashed beneath them as they fought, helpless humans looking up in terror at the streaks of light that heralded their passing. Wherever they touched down, destruction followed, buildings collapsed, streets cratered, lives ended in an instant. "Please, somebody help us," a woman screamed as the battling titans crashed through her apartment building. "What's happening?" a man shouted, clutching his child to his chest as they ran from the collapsing structure. "It's the end of the world," another answered, his voice hollow with despair. "God has abandoned us." Sukuna heard their cries, felt their fear like a physical weight. These were not his people. He had never claimed humanity as his to protect, but they were innocent bystanders in a conflict they couldn't comprehend. Conquest showed no such concern. He reveled in the destruction, in the terror, in the death that followed in their wake. Each scream seemed to energize him, driving him to greater heights of violence. "Can you hear them?" he asked Sukuna as they grappled mid-air. "The sweet music of their fear? This is what I live for." "You live for nothing," Sukuna replied, landing a blow that shattered several of Conquest's teeth. "You exist only to fulfill others' purposes. A weapon, not a being." Rage flashed across Conquest's face. "I am more than a weapon." "Are you?" Sukuna countered, evading a wild swing. "Then why do you follow orders you despise? Why do you commit atrocities that you yourself earlier alluded to not bringing you satisfaction? You're a tool, Conquest. Nothing more." "Shut up." Conquest roared, his attacks becoming less precise, more fueled by emotion than strategy. Sukuna used this to his advantage, redirecting the Viltrumite's momentum, using his own strength against him. But the poison in his system was still working against him, slowing his reactions, weakening his connection to his cursed energy. And Conquest, for all his emotional instability, was still one of the most powerful beings in the galaxy. His physical strength remained overwhelming, his durability beyond anything Sukuna had encountered since his awakening in this world. Especially after devouring his other self, magnifying his strength immensely. The battle carried them back toward where it had begun, the suburban neighborhood now unrecognizable after the devastation they had wrought. The Grayson home was completely destroyed, but there was no sign of the Marks, the Debbies, or the injured Nolan. They had escaped, at least. Sukuna felt his transformation failing, the strain of maintaining his four-armed form becoming too much with the poison disrupting his energy flow. His body shimmered, the extra arms dissolving as he reverted to his original form. Still powerful, still enhanced, but no longer the full manifestation of the King of Curses. Conquest noticed the change immediately, his scarred face splitting into a triumphant grin. "Weakening already? The compound works even better than our scientists predicted." "I have enough left for you," Sukuna replied, his voice steady despite the strain evident in his posture. They clashed again, their movements creating sonic booms that shattered any windows that had somehow survived the earlier devastation. Though reduced to his two-armed form, Sukuna fought with undiminished skill, each movement precisely calculated for maximum effect. Conquest matched him blow for blow, his wild fighting style contrasting with Sukuna's controlled technique. They were opposites in many ways, one a creature of pure emotion and instinct, the other a being of calculation and strategy. Yet both were killers, both were monsters in their own way. "We're not so different, you and I," Conquest observed during a brief respite as they circled each other. Both feared. Both alone. Both beyond the comprehension of lesser beings. The difference, Sukuna replied, is that I choose my path. You merely follow the one laid out for you. Conquest's expression darkened. You think I have a choice? The Empire is everything. Without it, I am nothing. A convenient excuse for a lack of will, Sukuna countered. With renewed fury, Conquest attacked again. They traded devastating blows, each impact creating craters in the already ruined landscape. Blood spattered the ground beneath them as they fought with increasing desperation. Both were tiring now, the extended battle taking its toll even on their superhuman endurance. Conquest's movements were becoming slower, his attacks less precise. The poison in Sukuna's system prevented him from healing properly, each wound remaining open longer than it should have. Yet neither would yield. They stood amid the ruins of what had once been a peaceful neighborhood, bloodied, battered but unbowed. Their eyes locked, Conquest's single-functioning orb burning with hatred and something almost like respect, Sukuna's twin pools of crimson reflecting nothing but cold determination. One way or another, Conquest gasped, blood bubbling from his lips, this ends now. On that, Sukuna agreed, his own breathing labored, we are in agreement. They charged each other one final time, each summoning their remaining strength for a decisive blow. Their fists drew back, muscles tensed, the very air seeming to hold its breath in anticipation of the collision. It never came. A blur of motion intercepted Conquest mid-charge, yanking him away from Sukuna with such force that the air displaced by the movement created a vacuum. Before either combatant could process what was happening, Conquest was suspended in midair, held aloft by a figure in a familiar blue and yellow costume. Except this wasn't Mark Grayson, not the original, not the altered. This was someone else entirely. Someone with the same face but different eyes, harder, colder, more calculating. Megumi. The newcomer said, his voice filled with unmistakable relief as he looked at Sukuna. I finally found you. Then, with a casualness that belied the immense strength required, he tore Conquest in half with his bare hands. The Viltrumite enforcer didn't even have time to scream before his body was separated at the waist, red blood and internal organs spilling onto the devastated ground below. The newcomer discarded the pieces without a second glance, his attention fixed solely on Sukuna. His expression was one of pure joy, of completion, as if he had found something precious that had long been lost. I've been looking everywhere for you, he said, taking a step toward the battered king of curses. Across dimensions, across realities. And here you are. Sukuna studied the newcomer carefully, noting the similarities to Mark Grayson, but also the profound differences. This was a being who had seen things, done things, that had fundamentally altered him. Who are you? Sukuna asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. The newcomer smiled, a smile that held affection but also something darker, something possessive. Don't you recognize me, Megumi? It's me, Mark. He spread his arms, as if inviting inspection. Different timeline, different experiences, but still me. Still your Mark. Behind him, the two halves of Conquest twitched, Viltrumite regeneration already beginning to work despite the catastrophic damage. Without looking, the newcomer, unmasked Mark, stomped on the upper half's head, crushing it with casual brutality. Sorry about the interruption, he said, turning his attention back to Sukuna. But I couldn't let him hurt you anymore. You're too important. His eyes, so like Mark's yet so different, gleamed with an intensity that bordered on fanaticism. I've been searching for you since the dimensional barriers started breaking down. And now that I've found you, I'm never letting you go again. The possessiveness in his voice was unmistakable, as was the devotion and the danger. This was not the Mark Grayson that Sukuna knew. This was something else entirely. And as the sun set over the devastated landscape, casting long shadows across the ruins of what had once been a peaceful suburb, Sukuna found himself facing a new and unexpected threat, one born not of hatred or conquest, but of twisted love. Author's note. So, I wish to clarify some misunderstood things. First things first, why no Maharaga against conquest? Reason, because just like in JJK canon, in the four-armed form Sukuna can't use the 10 shadows. I didn't change that since I want the Megumi form to have its relevance. Otherwise a guy like Sukuna who loves strength will never transform back. Now, the big elephant in the room. The compound poison. I already around 30 chapters ago established that Viltrumites were interested in the spiritual and magic, and already stated since the very beginning of this FIC that it is an AU. The fact there are more surviving Viltrumites isn't just for the fun of it. It's because there were those scientists who studied magic enough to be able to save themselves and others. I really like Invincible and JJK. I wouldn't write pointless plots. If I write or allude to something, like the fact Battle Beast's daggers were able to disrupt Sukuna's cursed energy, since cursed energy is formed from emotions in a spiritual aspect, I already dropped the hint for something like this. So no dismantles, no domain, also because Debbie and Mark and the others were too close. No good control for RCT and enough reinforcement. Now, it working in the future? No, Sukuna is too smart for that and has Maharaga. So yeah, hope that clarified everything. Bye. Sukuna studied the newcomer carefully, his body still tense from battle despite his exhaustion. The being before him wore Mark Grayson's face but carried himself with an authority that neither version of Mark he knew possessed. There was something imperial in his bearing, something dangerous in the casual way he had dismembered Conquest without hesitation. Your Mark. Sukuna repeated, his voice neutral despite his wariness. I think you're confused. Unmasked Mark's smile didn't falter, though something flickered in his eyes. Disappointment, perhaps, or impatience. I understand, he said, his tone gentle but insistent. The dimensional merger is disorienting. You might not recognize me immediately. He took another step forward, and Sukuna noticed how the ground seemed to tremble slightly beneath his feet, not from unsteadiness, but from barely contained power. But it's me, Megumi. Your Mark. Your brother in all but blood. His voice softened further, taking on a quality of reverence. Do you remember when we were kids? When you found me behind the school, getting beaten up by those seniors? You were just the new transfer student, but you stepped in without hesitation. Sukuna remained silent, his expression revealing nothing as Unmasked Mark continued, his eyes taking on a distant quality as he recalled memories that weren't shared by the being before him. You taught me how to stand up for myself. How to think strategically. How to see the world as it truly is, not as I wished it to be. Unmasked Mark's smile turned wistful. Remember our pact? Under that old oak tree in your backyard? A better world, you said. Not through brute force, but through vision. He gestured expansively, as if showcasing an invisible empire. I've built it, Megumi. Everything we talked about. Everything you envisioned. The Viltrumite Empire reborn under my leadership, guided by your principles. Strength with purpose. Power with vision. I am not the Megumi you knew, Sukuna stated flatly. I may wear his face, but I am someone else entirely. Unmasked Mark's smile dimmed, tinged with something like pity. You always did that, tried to distance yourself when emotions became too intense. It was your way of protecting yourself. He shook his head fondly. But you never needed to protect yourself from me. Not from your brother. You're not listening, Sukuna said, his patience wearing thin. I am not your friend. I am not your brother. I am Sukuna. Sukuna, Unmasked Mark repeated, testing the name. Your hero identity in this timeline? Interesting choice. He nodded as if approving. Strong. Distinctive. I like it. He moved closer, his eyes never leaving Sukuna's face. Eve misses you terribly, you know. In my world, she's never been the same since my father took you from us. This caught Sukuna's attention. Eve. Yes, Unmasked Mark confirmed, something softening in his expression. You two were inseparable. Not just romantically, though you were that too, but intellectually. Two brilliant minds that found each other in a world of mediocrity. He sighed, a sound heavy with remembered grief. She's never moved on. Never even looked at anyone else. How could I? She told me once. He was the only one who ever truly saw me. Unmasked Mark's expression darkened. She was there when my father killed you. Tried to stop him, nearly died herself. The way she screamed your name. He shuddered at the memory. I still hear it in my nightmares. Your father killed your Megumi, Sukuna noted, probing for information while assessing his options. Why? A shadow passed over unmasked Mark's face, his expression hardening into something cold and vengeful. To prove a point. To show me that humans were beneath us. That no human should have influence over a Viltrumite. His fists clenched at the memory. He called it a necessary lesson in detachment. And how did you respond to this lesson? Sukuna asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. I killed him, unmasked Mark stated simply, without emotion. Then I killed Thrag. Then I took control of the Empire and remade it according to the principles he had taught me. The casual way he described the murder of his father and the Viltrumite Grand Regent, beings of immense power, spoke volumes about his own capabilities. This was not someone to be underestimated. Do you remember our last conversation? Unmasked Mark asked suddenly, his voice taking on an almost childlike quality. The night before it happened? We were on your rooftop, looking at the stars. His eyes grew distant again, lost in memory. You pointed at the sky and told me that someday I would rule those stars. Not as a tyrant, but as a shepherd. The universe needs order, you said. But order without purpose is just tyranny. Unmasked Mark's focus returned to Sukuna, his expression intense. I fulfilled that prophecy, brother. I've created the order you envisioned. And now, by some miracle of the multiverse, I found you again. We can complete what we started together. And if I decline? Sukuna asked, his tone deliberately neutral. Something dark flashed across unmasked Mark's face, a glimpse of the violence that lurked beneath his controlled exterior. For a moment, he looked capable of the same casual brutality he had displayed with Conquest. Then the moment passed, his expression smoothing back into earnest persuasion. This dimension is collapsing, he pointed out reasonably. The merger is accelerating. Soon there will be only one reality, one version of each of us. He extended his hand. Come with me willingly, and I'll ensure it's us who survive the merger. You and me, as it should be. As it was meant to be. Before Sukuna could respond, a familiar voice called out from above. Megumi. Both turned to see altered Eve descending from the sky, her body glowing with pink energy. Her expression shifted from relief at finding Sukuna to confusion at the sight of yet another mark. Eve, Sukuna acknowledged, his tone carrying a warning she immediately recognized. She landed a cautious distance away, her eyes darting between Sukuna and unmasked Mark. Are you okay? She asked, taking in Sukuna's battered appearance and the remains of Conquest scattered nearby. I'm fine, Sukuna replied, though the statement was obviously untrue. This is another Mark. From a different timeline. Unmasked Mark studied Eve with intense interest, his expression softening in recognition. Eve, he said, his voice gentle. You look so much like her. My Eve. Though she wears her grief more visibly than you. Eve's eyes narrowed at his tone. And who exactly are you? I'm Mark Grayson, he replied simply. Emperor of the Viltrumite Empire, ruler of 17 galaxies, and Megumi's brother in all but blood. Eve's gaze snapped to Sukuna, a question in her eyes. Emperor? He's from a timeline where Megumi existed but was killed by Nolan, Sukuna explained briefly. He believes I'm the same person. Because you are, unmasked Mark insisted gently. Different experiences, perhaps, but the same soul. Eve moved closer to Sukuna, her protective instinct evident in her posture. Well, sorry to disappoint you, Your Majesty, but Megumi, or Sukuna, as we know him, is staying right here. With us. With me. Unmasked Mark's expression shifted as he reassessed Eve. Ah, he said, understanding dawning. You and he are together in this timeline too. The way he said it carried a strange mixture of approval and possessiveness, as if he were evaluating a familiar pattern rather than discovering something new. Yes, Eve confirmed, her own voice taking on a protective edge. We are. In my world, you never stopped loving him, Unmasked Mark said, his voice softening. Even after he was gone, you remained faithful to his memory, to his vision. A sad smile touched his lips. She'll be overjoyed to know I've found him. Found you. That we can be together again. The three of us, as we were always meant to be. This isn't your timeline, Eve pointed out, pink energy beginning to swirl around her hands. And Sukuna isn't your Megumi. Unmasked Mark's expression hardened. The dimensional merger will resolve such discrepancies. Only one version of each of us can survive when the barriers fully collapse. Is that a threat? Eve demanded, the energy around her hands intensifying. Simply a statement of fact, Unmasked Mark replied with a shrug. The multiverse abhors redundancy. It will correct itself, one way or another. His eyes fixed on Sukuna. The only question is which versions will remain when the dust settles. The tension in the air was palpable, Eve's protective rage meeting Unmasked Mark's cold determination with Sukuna caught between them. Before the situation could escalate further, another voice joined the conversation. There you are. Astronaut Mark called, descending from the sky with Dark Mark close behind him. We've been searching everywhere for you. Unmasked Mark turned to regard his counterparts with mild irritation. I told you to wait at the rendezvous point. Yeah, well, when dimensional barriers are collapsing and reality itself is on the verge of imploding, waiting isn't really an option, Astronaut Mark replied dryly. He glanced at Sukuna, then at Eve, assessing the situation quickly. I see you found him. Yes, Unmasked Mark confirmed, his voice softening as he looked back at Sukuna. Just as I said I would. Dark Mark landed silently, his hooded costume casting his face in shadow. He kept his distance from everyone, observing rather than participating. And I see you've already eliminated the competition, Astronaut Mark noted, gesturing toward conquest's remains with professional detachment. Efficient as always. He was hurting Megumi, Unmasked Mark replied, as if that explained and justified everything, which to him it clearly did. Eve stepped closer to Sukuna, her hand finding his in a gesture that was both supportive and possessive. What's going on here? She asked, her voice low. Who are all these marks? Variants, Sukuna replied simply. From different timelines. Different experiences, different choices. As Unmasked Mark opened his mouth to speak again, a sudden blue light enveloped both Sukuna and Eve, growing in intensity until it was almost blinding. What? Unmasked Mark began, his eyes widening in alarm. Before anyone could react, Sukuna and Eve vanished in a flash of blue energy, teleported away without warning. For a moment, Unmasked Mark stood frozen, staring at the empty space where they had been. Then his expression contorted with rage, a primal fury that transformed his features into something barely recognizable. "No!" he roared, the sound carrying such force that it shattered windows for miles around. "Bring him back!" The ground beneath his feet cracked, fissures spreading outward as his power surged uncontrolled. The sky darkened as clouds were drawn toward the epicenter of his rage, swirling in an unnatural vortex above them. "Mark!" Astronaut Mark shouted, moving to restrain his counterpart. "Control yourself." They took him. Unmasked Mark raged, his voice carrying for miles, echoing across the devastated landscape. They took him from me again. His power continued to build, the air around him becoming superheated, rippling with the force of his fury. Trees uprooted, debris lifted into the air, drawn into the vortex of his unleashed power. If you destroy this planet, you'll lose him forever. Astronaut Mark shouted, grabbing Unmasked Mark's shoulders and forcing him to make eye contact. Think, Mark. This is Cecil's doing. The GDA. They've teleported him to their facility. Destroying the planet won't bring him back. It will only ensure you never see him again. Slowly, painfully, reason began to penetrate Unmasked Mark's blind rage. His breathing slowed, the vortex of power gradually subsiding. But the cold fury in his eyes remained, focused now rather than chaotic. Cecil, he said, the name a curse on his lips. Always interfering. Always manipulating. We'll find him, Astronaut Mark assured him, cautiously releasing his grip. We'll track him down. But destroying everything won't help. Unmasked Mark nodded, his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles visibly strained beneath his skin. Find him, he ordered, his voice deadly calm now. Find him before sunset. Or I'll tear this planet apart piece by piece until he's returned to me. Dark Mark, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. What about the woman? The Eve from this timeline? Unmasked Mark's expression hardened further. She was taken with him. Another manipulation by Cecil, no doubt, trying to use her to influence him. Or perhaps they're genuinely connected, Dark Mark suggested quietly. As you said, your Megumi was with your Eve. It doesn't matter, Unmasked Mark dismissed. When the merger completes, only one version of each person will remain. My Eve is the strongest. She's endured decades without him, kept his memory alive, dedicated herself to our shared vision. His eyes narrowed as he stared in the direction of the GDA headquarters, visible as a distant structure on the horizon. She deserves to be reunited with him, and I intend to ensure that happens. The blue light faded, and Sukuna found himself standing in the middle of a reinforced monitoring center with Eve at his side, her hand still clasped in his. The transition had been jarring, unexpected, a teleportation technology he hadn't encountered before. What the hell? Eve gasped, momentarily disoriented by the sudden displacement. Sorry for the abrupt extraction, Cecil Stedman's voice came from behind them. But the situation was escalating beyond acceptable parameters. They turned to see not one but two Cecil standing side by side, their identical expressions of calculated concern almost comical in their symmetry. Behind them, a wall of monitors displayed various angles of the devastation where they had just been, with Unmasked Mark at the center of a growing vortex of power. That was unwise, Sukuna stated flatly, watching as Unmasked Mark's rage manifested in destructive waves that rippled outward from his position. He will not react well to our sudden disappearance. We're counting on it, one of the Cecils, the original Timeline's version, Sukuna noted, replied. His reaction will tell us exactly what we're dealing with. While putting countless lives at risk, Eve countered, her tone sharp with anger. You can't just teleport people without warning. A calculated risk, Altered Cecil acknowledged, but one that provides valuable intelligence. On the monitors, they could see Astronaut Mark restraining Unmasked Mark, clearly trying to talk him down from his fury. The audio feed crackled with static, but Unmasked Mark's voice came through clearly enough. They took him from me again. Fascinating, Original Cecil murmured, studying the readings on a nearby console. The power output is off the charts. He's potentially stronger than any Viltrumite we've encountered, including Nolan. He's unstable, Altered Cecil observed. Emotionally compromised. That makes him both more dangerous and more vulnerable. Eve stepped closer to the monitors, her expression a complex mixture of curiosity and possessive concern as she watched Unmasked Mark's rage gradually subside under Astronaut Mark's intervention. He truly believes you're his Megumi, she said to Sukuna, her voice low. The intensity of his reaction. It's not just an act. Obsession rarely is, Sukuna replied, his eyes never leaving the screens. He's built his entire identity around a relationship that no longer exists. Around a person who is gone. Eve's grip on his hand tightened almost imperceptibly. I can understand that, she admitted, so quietly that only Sukuna could hear. The fear of losing you, of having you taken away. Sukuna glanced at her, noting the intensity in her eyes that mirrored, in its own way, the possessiveness they had witnessed in Unmasked Mark. The parallel wasn't lost on him. The seeds of the same obsession existed within Eve, carefully controlled but undeniably present. We should check on the others, Altered Cecil interrupted, either oblivious to or deliberately ignoring the moment between them. They've been waiting for news of your condition. The others? Sukuna questioned. Both Marks, both Debbie's and Nolan, Original Cecil explained. They're in the medical wing. Nolan's injuries are extensive. Lead the way, Sukuna instructed, though his attention remained on the monitors for a moment longer. watching as unmasked Mark stared in the direction of the GDA facility with cold determination. The Emperor's parting words were clear even through the static. Find him before sunset. Or I'll tear this planet apart piece by piece until he's returned to me. The Cecils led them through reinforced corridors to a larger medical chamber. Inside, they found both versions of Mark. Both Debbies gathered around a medical bed where Nolan lay, his shoulders ending in bandaged stumps where his arms had been. "Megumi!" Altered Mark exclaimed, relief evident in his voice. "Eve, you're alive." "No thanks to that psycho version of you," Original Mark added, his expression darkening, both having heard the more loud sayings with their enhanced hearing. "Who the hell was that guy?" "Another variant," Sukuna replied simply. "One from a timeline where Megumi Fushiguro was killed by Nolan Grayson." Both Debbies gasped, their hands moving to cover their mouths in identical gestures of horror. Nolan, despite his grievous injuries, managed to look both pained and guilty at the revelation. "He seemed obsessed with you," Altered Mark noted, his gaze moving between Sukuna and Eve with concern. "He believes I am his lost friend Reborn," Sukuna confirmed. "His brother, as he put it. The architect of his empire." "Empire?" Original Mark questioned, his brow furrowing. "He rules the Viltrumite Empire in his reality," Eve explained, still visibly shaken by the confrontation. 17 galaxies, by his account. After killing his father and Thrag in revenge for Megumi's death. He killed Thrag. Nolan's voice was hoarse with pain and disbelief. "That's almost inconceivable." "And now he wants you to join him," Altered Mark concluded. "To rule with him." "Yes," Sukuna confirmed. "And he's willing to eliminate anyone he perceives as an obstacle to that goal. Including us," Original Mark realized. "All of us. Anyone who might keep you here instead of going with him." "We need to prepare," Eve said, her grip on Sukuna's hand tightening. "He'll come for you. It's only a matter of time." "He's already given me until sunset to consider his offer," Sukuna replied. "But your teleportation stunt may have accelerated his timeline." "We're monitoring the situation," Original Cecil assured them. "The moment he makes a move, we'll know." "And then what?" Original Debbie demanded, fear and frustration evident in her voice. "He tore Conquest apart like he was nothing. He's clearly more powerful than either version of my son. What exactly is your plan for stopping him?" The Cecils exchanged glances, a wordless communication passing between them. "We're working on several contingencies," Altered Cecil said carefully, "including dimensional containment technology that might allow us to isolate him from our merged reality. In the meantime," Original Cecil continued, "we need to understand exactly what we're facing with this dimensional merger. The readings are concerning. The barriers are collapsing at an accelerating rate," Altered Cecil elaborated. "According to our calculations, we have less than 24 hours before the process reaches critical mass." "And then," Altered Mark prompted. "And then the multiverse resolves the redundancies," Original Cecil stated grimly. "Only one version of each person can exist when the dust settles. Which means most of us in this room won't survive," Altered Debbie concluded. "Unless we find a way to control the process," Altered Cecil countered, "to determine which versions remain." "He mentioned his Eve," Altered Eve said suddenly, her voice taking on an edge that Sukuna recognized all too well. "He said she remained faithful to Megumi's memory even after death. He seems to think his Eve is the true version who should survive the merger," Altered Cecil noted. "Just as he believes he's the true Mark." "He's planning something," Sukuna stated. "The merger may be a natural phenomenon, but he intends to control the outcome." "Nolan needs medical attention that we can't provide here," Altered Debbie interjected, her hand resting gently on her husband's forehead. "The regeneration process has started, but it's slow. Too slow." "Viltrumite healing is remarkable," Nolan managed through gritted teeth, "but even we have limits. Regrowing limbs takes time." "Time we don't have," Original Mark pointed out. "Not with Crazy Mark out there looking for Megumi and the dimensional merger accelerating." Sukuna studied the injured Viltrumite, his mind calculating possibilities, strategies, contingencies. "There may be a way to accelerate your healing," he said finally. "But it would require me to regain full access to my cursed energy. The poison conquest injected is still disrupting my abilities." "I can help with that," Altered Eve volunteered immediately. "I've been studying your molecular structure since we met. If you let me examine the poison's effects, I can neutralize it with the right molecular restructuring." The eagerness in her voice, the intensity of her focus on him, only underscored what Sukuna had observed earlier. In another timeline, under different circumstances, this Eve could very easily have become like unmasked Mark's Eve, defined entirely by her connection to him, her identity subsumed by her devotion. "Do it," Sukuna instructed. "And while you work on that, we need to prepare for unmasked Mark's return. He won't wait until sunset. Not now." "I'll put all GDA resources on any possible preparations immediately," Altered Cecil decided. As the group dispersed to their various tasks, Eve remained at Sukuna's side, her expression troubled. "He said his Eve never stopped loving Megumi," she said quietly. "That she remained faithful even after death." "So he claimed," Sukuna replied non-committally. "It's strange," she continued, her voice thoughtful. "Across different realities, different timelines, we still find each other. You and I." Sukuna studied her face, noting the complex emotions playing across her features. "Perhaps some connections transcend dimensional boundaries," he acknowledged. "Or perhaps I'm just drawn to power," she suggested, a hint of rare self-awareness showing through. "In every reality. Obsessed with understanding the strongest being I've encountered." There was a moment of vulnerability in her admission, a recognition of her own nature that she rarely displayed. But it passed quickly, replaced by the familiar intensity that characterized her feelings toward him. "His Eve devoted decades to Megumi's memory," she said, her voice taking on a harder edge. "Built her entire life around preserving what they had, what they believed in." "And you find that concerning?" Sukuna asked, though he already knew the answer. Eve's eyes met his, unflinching in their honesty. "I find it understandable," she corrected. "If I lost you, if someone took you from me the way Nolan took Megumi from her." She didn't finish the thought, but she didn't need to. The implication was clear: she would become like unmasked Mark's Eve. She would devote herself to his memory, to his vision. She would wait decades for a chance to have him back, just as she would fight to keep him now. "You won't lose me," Sukuna stated, the words more promise than reassurance. Eve's smile was small but genuine. "No," she agreed. "I won't." Outside the reinforced walls of the GDA facility, the sky continued to ripple with emerald energy, the dimensional barriers growing thinner with each passing moment. And somewhere out there, an emperor prepared for war, determined to reclaim what he saw as rightfully his, the brother he had lost, the architect of his empire, the friend without whom his vast conquests meant nothing. The clock was ticking toward sunset, but no one believed they had even that long before the storm broke. The GDA facility hummed with activity as teams of scientists and agents worked frantically to monitor the dimensional anomalies spreading across the planet. Amidst this controlled chaos, Original Mark stood by a reinforced window, staring out at the rippling green sky with a troubled expression. "Hey," Altered Mark said, approaching his counterpart cautiously. "How are you holding up?" Original Mark shrugged, not turning from the window. "Oh, just another day. Psychotic version of us shows up, wants to kidnap your best friend, and oh yeah, the universe is collapsing." His attempt at humor fell flat, even to his own ears. Altered Mark stood beside him, joining him in watching the unnatural sky. For a moment, they stood in silence, two versions of the same person contemplating very different lives. "Can we talk?" Original Mark asked suddenly. "Somewhere private?" Altered Mark looked surprised but nodded. "Sure. There's a balcony on the east side. Should be quiet." They made their way through the facility, nodding to agents who did double-takes at seeing two identical Invincibles walking side by side. The balcony was indeed deserted, offering a panoramic view of the city below, a strange hybrid of two merged realities, landmarks from both their worlds existing in impossible proximity. So, Altered Mark began awkwardly. What did you want to dash? I'm sorry, Original Mark interrupted, the words coming out in a rush. For being a prick. For the attitude, the comments, all of it. Altered Mark blinked in surprise. You don't have to dash. No, I do, Original Mark insisted, finally turning to face his counterpart directly. I've been treating you like you did something wrong, just because. He trailed off, struggling to articulate his feelings. Because I got the life you should have had. Altered Mark finished for him. Original Mark nodded, his expression pained. Your dad never betrayed you. Never killed the Guardians. Never tried to kill you. You still have a family, both parents, intact. And it's not your fault, but I've been acting like it is. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture both versions shared when stressed. It's just hard, you know? Seeing what could have been. What should have been. Altered Mark leaned against the railing, considering his words carefully. I get it. If our situations were reversed, I'd probably feel the same way. He sighed. Sometimes I still can't believe how close I came to living your life. What do you mean? If Megumi hadn't intervened when he did, if he hadn't confronted my dad in the Flaxen dimension. He shook his head. Everything would have played out exactly like it did for you. Dad would have killed the Guardians. Would have tried to make me join him in conquering Earth. Original Mark's expression darkened at the memory. The worst part wasn't the beating. It was the betrayal. Finding out everything was a lie. I can't imagine, Altered Mark said quietly. Well, I can, but I don't want to. And that's why I don't blame you for resenting me. I don't resent you, Original Mark clarified. Not really. I resent the situation. And I took it out on you because you're an easy target, I guess. He extended his hand. So I'm sorry. You didn't ask for any of this any more than I did. Altered Mark took his hand, shaking it firmly. Apology accepted. And for what it's worth, I think you've handled everything pretty well, all things considered. I don't know if I would have been as strong. Original Mark snorted. Trust me, you don't get a choice. When the world goes to hell, you either get stronger or you break. I guess we're both pretty good at not breaking, Altered Mark observed with a small smile. They turned back to the view, standing shoulder to shoulder as they watched the dimensional energy continue to pulse across the sky. So, Original Mark said after a moment, Megumi. He's really that important to you? Altered Mark nodded without hesitation. He saved my family. He saved my future. Everything I have, I owe to him in some way. And that's why Unmasked Mark is so obsessed with him? Because in his world, Megumi did the same for him but then died. I think so, Altered Mark agreed. I mean, I can understand it, in a way. If I lost Megumi, especially if it was my dad who killed him. He shuddered at the thought. I might go off the deep end too. Original Mark studied his counterpart's expression. You really care about him, don't you? He's my best friend, Altered Mark said simply. My brother, in all the ways that matter. He sees me, not Invincible, not the son of Omni-Man, just me. And he's always been there when I needed him most. Original Mark nodded, understanding dawning. I had that with William before everything got complicated. Having someone who just gets you, who you don't have to explain yourself to. Exactly, Altered Mark agreed. So when I see Unmasked Mark, as crazy as he is, I get it. I really do. He lost the one person who understood him completely. Doesn't excuse trying to kidnap your friend though, Original Mark pointed out. No, Altered Mark conceded. It doesn't. And we're going to stop him. Together. Original Mark smiled, a genuine smile, the first he directed at his counterpart since they'd met. Together, he agreed. So what's our play here? How do we take down a version of ourselves who's apparently powerful enough to kill Thrag? I've been thinking about that, Altered Mark said, his expression turning serious. We need to use his obsession against him. He's so focused on getting Megumi back that he's not thinking clearly. That gives us an advantage. A small one, Original Mark cautioned. He's still ridiculously powerful. True, but we have something he doesn't. What's that? Altered Mark grinned. 2 of us. Plus our dad, who, arms or no arms, is still Omni-Man. Plus the Guardians, the team, and most importantly, the actual Megumi that Emperor Mark wants so badly. You think Megumi, Sukuna, would help us fight him? Original Mark asked. I know he would, Altered Mark replied with absolute certainty. He's not about to let some alternate version of me drag him off to rule the galaxy, no matter how much that version thinks they're brothers. Original Mark nodded, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time, hope. All right then. Let's go make a plan to take down the Emperor of the Universe. Now you're talking, Altered Mark said, clapping his counterpart on the shoulder. As they turned to head back inside, Original Mark paused. Hey, for what it's worth. I'm glad at least one version of us got to have a normal life. Well, as normal as it gets when you're half Viltrumite. Altered Mark's expression softened. And for what it's worth, I think you might be the stronger version of us. You've been through hell and you're still standing. That counts for something. Thanks, Original Mark said, genuinely touched. Now let's go save the multiverse. Together, the 2 Marks walked back into the facility, no longer divided by resentment and jealousy, but united in purpose. They had a common enemy now, a version of themselves twisted by loss and obsession, and they would face him together. Meanwhile, in the ruins of the Grayson family home, Emperor Mark, the unmasked Mark, sat amid the devastation, his expression calm despite the destruction surrounding him. The rage that had nearly consumed him earlier had cooled into something more controlled, more focused, but no less dangerous. He held a small photograph in his hands, salvaged from the wreckage, a family portrait of this world's Graysons. Mark, Nolan, and Debbie, smiling for the camera, unaware of the tragedy that would eventually tear them apart. So different, he murmured, studying the image. Yet so familiar. He carefully tucked the photograph into his pocket, a souvenir of this doomed timeline. His counterparts had not yet returned with news of Megumi's location, but he was patient. The GDA facilities were the obvious places to look, and when the time came, he would tear it apart stone by stone if necessary. A shadow fell across him, and Emperor Mark looked up, immediately alert. A figure stood at the edge of the ruined living room, a young Japanese man with haunted eyes and an aura of power that even Emperor Mark could sense. You're not him, Emperor Mark said, rising to his feet with fluid grace. But you're close. Very close. The newcomer studied him with cold calculation. And you're not the Mark Grayson I sensed earlier. Your power signature is different. Stronger. I'm the version that matters, Emperor Mark replied simply. The one who will survive when the merger completes. The young man tilted his head slightly, assessing. I am Sukuna, he introduced himself, though his appearance was nothing like the 4-armed being Emperor Mark had encountered earlier. Emperor Mark's eyes narrowed as understanding dawned. You're another version of him. Of Megumi. A smile spread across his face, not warm, but triumphant. Another incarnation. But not the one I knew. No, Yakuna agreed, his voice carrying an ancient quality that belied his youthful appearance. I am what came before. What he once was, in another life, another world. Emperor Mark circled him slowly, studying every detail. I can see it now. The same soul, but darker, wilder. His expression hardened, unrefined. Yukuna's lips curved in a cold smile. I came to test myself against the strongest being I've sensed since arriving in this dimension. To see if the Emperor of the Viltrumites lives up to his reputation. You came seeking combat, Emperor Mark translated, his own smile turning predatory. How fortunate. I find myself in need of distraction while I wait for my associates to return with news of your counterpart. My counterpart, Sukuna repeated, his eyes gleaming with interest. The one who bears 4 arms and calls himself the King of Curses? I sensed him as well. A curious evolution of what I once was. He is the perfected version, Emperor Mark stated with absolute conviction. The one who guided me, taught me, made me what I am today. Sukuna laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Perfected? No. Diluted, perhaps. Compromised by humanity. He flexed his fingers, cursed energy beginning to swirl around them. I am the true King of Curses. The original. The pure essence of what he pretends to be. Emperor Mark's expression darkened. You know nothing of him. Of what he is capable of. Of what we built together. I know enough, Sukuna countered, his posture shifting subtly as he prepared for combat. I know that I am here to test my power against yours. To determine which of us is truly superior. A test. Emperor Mark's voice took on a dangerous edge. You think to test me? I, who conquered the Viltrumite Empire. Who killed Thrag with my bare hands. Who rules 17 galaxies. The air around him began to shimmer with power, the ground beneath his feet cracking from the pressure of his barely contained strength. You are but a shadow of the Megumi I knew, Emperor Mark continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. A crude predecessor to his greatness. But if combat is what you seek. He moved into a fighting stance, his eyes locked on Sukuna's. Then I will oblige. Perhaps it will help pass the time until I recover what is rightfully mine. Sukuna's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp for a human mouth. Good, he said simply, cursed energy now visibly manifesting around him in patterns that spoke of ancient, terrible power. Let us see if the Emperor deserves his crown. The two stood facing each other amid the ruins. 2 beings of immense power from different worlds, different realities, each convinced of their own superiority. The dimensional energy in the sky pulsed more intensely above them, as if the multiverse itself was holding its breath in anticipation of their clash. And as sunset approached, the battle between the Emperor and the King was about to begin. Eve, Emperor Mark Universe Eve SPOV. The Imperial Observatory towered above the Viltrumite capital, its crystalline spire reaching toward the stars that the Empire claimed as its domain. Within its highest chamber, I stood before the dimensional viewer, my hands trembling slightly as I adjusted the controls. 17 years. It had been 17 years since I last saw his face. 17 years of preserving his memory, his vision, his legacy. 17 years of emptiness that no amount of power or purpose could fill. The viewer hummed to life, the quantum field stabilizers glowing with soft blue light as they processed the incoming data stream. Mark had been gone for 3 days now. 3 days since he had stepped through Levy's dimensional portal in search of something we had both given up hope of ever finding again. A second chance. Atom Eve. I turned at the sound of my name, my title really, though few remembered that it had once been a childish superhero name rather than the designation of one of the Empire's most powerful figures. Anissa stood in the doorway, her imposing Viltrumite frame silhouetted against the corridor lights. The latest transmission is coming through, she said, stepping into the chamber. I thought you'd want to know immediately. My heart stuttered in my chest. How long ago was it sent? About 6 hours, Anissa replied, moving to stand beside me at the control panel. The quantum fluctuations are getting worse. The delay is increasing. I nodded, trying to maintain my composure despite the anxiety churning inside me. Is it clear? Last time, the interference was so bad we could barely make out Mark's surroundings. Much better this time, Anissa assured me, her fingers dancing across the controls. The engineers made some adjustments to the reception array. We should get both visual and audio. The dimensional communicator Mark had developed before his departure was a marvel of engineering, allowing us to receive visual data from his experiences in the parallel world. But the growing instability between dimensions meant each transmission took longer to reach us. Show me, I commanded, my voice steadier than I felt. Anissa's fingers moved across the control panel with practiced efficiency. The holographic display flickered, then stabilized, showing a scene from Mark's perspective. He was standing in what looked like a devastated suburban area, facing. The breath caught in my throat. "Megumi," I whispered, the name a prayer on my lips. There he was, different, changed, but unmistakably him. The same soul, the same presence that had been torn from us all those years ago. "It's really him," Anissa murmured beside me, her own voice tinged with disbelief. "After all this time." I stepped closer to the display, my fingers reaching out instinctively to touch the holographic image, passing through it like the ghost it was. "He's alive," I breathed. "In another dimension, another timeline, but alive." We watched in silence as the scene unfolded, Mark's voice coming through the transmission with surprising clarity. "Do you remember when we were kids? When you found me behind the school, getting beaten up by those seniors? You were just the new transfer student, but you stepped in without hesitation." I closed my eyes briefly, the memory washing over me. I had been there that day, watching from a distance as the new Japanese exchange student, small for his age but with eyes that seemed to see everything, had calmly stepped between Mark and 3 seniors twice his size. "You taught me how to stand up for myself. How to think strategically. How to see the world as it truly is, not as I wished it to be," Mark's voice continued from the recording. "Remember our pact? Under that old oak tree in your backyard? A better world, you said. Not through brute force, but through vision." "The oak tree," I murmured, a sad smile touching my lips. We were so young then. Just children with dreams bigger than we could understand. Anissa glanced at me. "You 3 were inseparable from the beginning, weren't you?" "From that very first day," I confirmed, my eyes never leaving the hologram. "Mark, Megumi, and me against the world. We thought we could change everything. And we did, just not in the way we expected." On the display, Megumi Sukuna, as he apparently called himself now, stood wary and confused, clearly not recognizing Mark or the shared history he described. "I am not the Megumi you knew," his voice stated flatly. "I may wear his face, but I am someone else entirely." The words sent a spike of pain through my chest, but I pushed it aside. It didn't matter. He was alive. He existed. And Mark would bring him home. "He calls himself Sukuna now," Anissa noted, watching the exchange with the analytical precision that had made her one of the Empire's most effective generals. "The King of Curses. Interesting title." "A different life," I acknowledged. "Different experiences. But it's still him. I can see it in his eyes." The footage continued, showing another figure arriving, a woman with pink energy surrounding her. My counterpart from that dimension. I watched with growing tension as she moved protectively to Megumi's side, her hand finding his in a gesture that was both possessive and intimate. "She's with him," I said, my voice hardening. "That world's version of me. They're together." Anissa glanced at me, concern flashing across her features. "Eve, it doesn't matter," I cut her off, though the lie was transparent even to my own ears. "She's irrelevant. When the merger completes, only one version of each person will remain." "And you believe it will be you," Anissa stated, not a question but an observation. I turned to her, my eyes glowing faintly with molecular energy. "I have waited 17 years. I have preserved his vision, his principles, helped Mark build the empire Megumi always said was possible. What has she done to earn her place at his side?" Anissa didn't flinch from my intensity, one of the few beings in the universe who could face my anger without fear. "Nothing," she agreed. "But the merger doesn't operate on merit. It follows its own laws." "Then we'll change those laws," I said simply. "Mark will find a way. He always does." We returned our attention to the footage, watching as more versions of Mark appeared, variants from other timelines, each different in subtle ways. Then, without warning, both Megumi and his Eve vanished in a flash of blue light, teleported away by unseen forces. Mark's rage was magnificent to behold, a pure, unrestrained fury that reminded me why he was emperor, why even the mightiest Viltrumites bowed before him. The transmission ended shortly after, cutting off as Mark issued commands to his variants to find Megumi before sunset. I stepped back from the viewer, my mind racing with implications, possibilities, plans. "He'll find him," I said with absolute certainty. "And when he does, he'll bring him home." "Eve," Anissa said carefully, "you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that this Megumi may not want to come. He has a life there. Connections those connections are temporary," I interrupted. "Illusions created by dimensional variance. What we had, what we built together, that was real. That was lasting." Anissa studied me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, with uncharacteristic gentleness, she asked, "Do you remember when we first met him? When he stormed into the High Council chamber?" The question caught me off guard, pulling me from my strategic calculations back into memories I both treasured and feared to examine too closely. "As if it were yesterday," I replied, my voice softening despite myself. 20 years earlier, the Great Hall of the Viltrumite High Council gleamed with polished stone and metal, its vast circular chamber designed to intimidate visitors with its sheer scale. Massive columns rose to a ceiling hundreds of feet above, and at the center, the council sat in a semicircle of raised thrones, with Grand Regent Thrag at the highest position. I stood with Mark near the entrance, both of us nervous but trying not to show it. We had been summoned to witness Nolan's formal reinstatement to the Viltrumite ranks after his successful mission on Earth, a mission that had unexpectedly resulted in his bringing his human wife and half-breed son to Viltrum. The proceedings were formal, filled with ancient ritual and ceremony that Mark found boring and I found fascinating. Thrag was in the middle of outlining new conquest strategies for the Andromeda sector when the massive doors at the far end of the chamber burst open. Every head turned as a small figure marched down the central aisle, a human boy, no more than 12 Earth years old, with dark hair and determined eyes. Megumi Fushiguro, the friend we had insisted on bringing with us despite Nolan's objections. "This is inefficient," he declared, his voice echoing in the sudden silence of the chamber. His accent was still thick then, yet precise but clearly not his native language. Thrag's expression darkened with rage at the interruption. "Who dares?" he thundered, rising from his throne. Guards moved to intercept Megumi, but he continued walking, pulling a rolled scroll from his backpack. "Your conquest strategy for Andromeda," he continued, seemingly oblivious to the danger he was in. "It will result in unnecessary casualties and extended time frames for complete subjugation." "Seize this human child," Thrag ordered, his voice cold with fury. 2 Viltrumite guards flew toward Megumi, but before they could reach him, he had unrolled his scroll on the floor, a detailed star map of the Andromeda sector, covered in notations and strategic markings. "Look," he commanded, pointing to specific regions on the map. "Your approach relies on overwhelming force applied simultaneously across 17 key systems. This ignores the established trade networks and defensive alliances between the outer colonies." The guards hesitated, looking to Thrag for guidance. The Grand Regent's expression was murderous, but there was also a flicker of something else, curiosity perhaps. "If you instead focus initial efforts here, and here," Megumi continued, circling 3 specific systems, "you disrupt their supply chains. The outer colonies become isolated, unable to support each other. They fall one by one with minimal resistance, reducing your casualties by approximately 60% while increasing territorial gains by 43% over the same time frame." The chamber was utterly silent as the boy continued his analysis, pointing out flaws in the Viltrumite strategy and offering alternatives with the confidence of a seasoned military commander. Mark and I exchanged glances of equal parts horror and pride. Horror at the danger our friend had placed himself in, pride at his unflinching courage. Finally, Thrag raised a hand, silencing Megumi mid-sentence. "You," he said, his voice dangerously soft, "a human child, presume to instruct the Viltrumite High Council on matters of conquest?" Megumi looked up, meeting the Grand Regent's gaze without a trace of fear. "I presume to identify inefficiency where I see it," he replied simply. "Whether you choose to correct it is your decision." I was certain we were about to witness our friend's execution. Thrag was known for his swift and brutal punishment of any who questioned his authority. But to everyone's shock, the Grand Regent laughed, a short, sharp sound like breaking stone. "Bring me that map," he ordered one of the guards. The Viltrumite delivered Megumi's scroll to Thrag, who examined it with narrowed eyes. The other council members leaned forward, studying the boy's strategic markings with expressions ranging from outrage to grudging interest. "These calculations," Thrag said finally, looking back at Megumi. "You did them yourself?" "Yes," Megumi replied without hesitation. "Based on what data?" "Public transmission records, trade manifests, defensive deployment patterns observed over the past 5 years," Megumi listed. "Plus historical conquest records from your own archives." "Our archives are sealed to outsiders," one council member objected. Megumi shrugged. "Your encryption was basic." Mark stifled a laugh beside me, earning a sharp look from his father. But Nolan's expression held something besides anger, a dawning realization, perhaps, that he had underestimated his son's human friend. Thrag studied Megumi for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he turned to the council. "Adjust the Andromeda strategy according to these recommendations," he ordered, to the visible shock of several members. "We will test the humans' theories." He turned back to Megumi. "If you are wrong, child, your life is forfeit. If you are right." He left the sentence unfinished, a rare concession from the Grand Regent. Megumi bowed slightly, a gesture that somehow managed to convey respect without submission. "I am not wrong," he said simply, then turned and walked back down the aisle to where Mark and I waited, his small shoulders squared, his pace unhurried despite having just challenged the most powerful being in the known universe. That was Megumi, always one willing to burn all away for his pleasures, even risk his own life if need be. "He was right, of course," Anissa said, pulling me back to the present. The Andromeda campaign proceeded exactly as he predicted. 63% reduction in Viltrumite casualties, 47% increase in territorial gains. "He was always right," I replied softly. "That was what made him so dangerous to some, and so valuable to others." "He was so small compared to us," Anissa continued, a faint smile touching her lips. "This human boy, barely reaching my waist, standing before the Viltrumite High Council without a trace of fear, telling Thrag himself that his conquest strategy was inefficient." Despite everything, I found myself smiling at the memory. Thrag wanted to kill him on the spot. Until Megumi outlined a plan that would reduce our casualties by 60% while increasing territorial gains, Anissa finished. Even Thrag couldn't argue with those numbers. After that, Thrag insisted on having him present for all strategic planning sessions, I recalled. The other council members were furious, a human child advising the Viltrumite Empire, but Thrag overruled them all. "Because results speak louder than pride," Anissa noted. And Megumi delivered results. I moved away from the viewer, walking to the chamber's vast window that overlooked the capital city, a gleaming metropolis that stood as testament to the order Megumi had envisioned and Mark had built. "Do you remember what he said to Thrag, years later, when the Grand Regent asked why he continued to help us conquer?" I asked, even though he knew what it meant for the conquered worlds. Anissa nodded. "Conquest is inevitable," he said. "But its nature is not. I cannot stop the tide, but I can direct its flow to minimize suffering." "He changed everything," I said softly. "Not through power, but through vision. Through understanding what the universe could be if strength were guided by wisdom." "He did," Anissa agreed, coming to stand beside me. Even those who hated him for being human had to respect his mind. I turned to her suddenly, a question forming that I had never dared to ask before. "Did you love him too, Anissa?" The question clearly startled her, her eyes widening in surprise. "What?" "It's a simple question," I pressed, studying her reaction. "Did you love Megumi?" Anissa looked away, her gaze fixing on the distant horizon. "That's complicated." "So you did," I concluded, a strange mixture of understanding and jealousy swirling within me. "It wasn't like that," she said after a moment. "Not exactly." She sighed, running a hand through her dark hair in a gesture reminiscent of Mark. "You have to understand the context. For millennia, we followed Emperor Argol because of his wisdom, his vision. The Empire prospered, expanded without significant resistance. We conquered, yes, but with purpose, with direction. She turned back to me, her expression earnest. When Megumi came, he reminded us of that time. Even though he wasn't Viltrumite, many of us, even Thrag, respected him because his wisdom, his tactics, his intelligence allowed us to conquer most of the known universe without meaningful challenge. That's why the Civil War happened, I realized aloud. Not just because Thrag refused to punish Nolan for killing Megumi Dash, but because half the Empire believed Nolan had destroyed our greatest asset, Anissa finished. Our truest link to the glory days of Argal's reign. I remembered that terrible day with painful clarity, finding Megumi's broken body in the palace gardens, Nolan standing over him with cold disdain. A necessary lesson in detachment, he had called it. A lesson for Mark, to show him that humans were beneath Viltrumites, that no human should have influence over their kind. He hadn't expected the Empire to fracture over his actions. Hadn't anticipated that Megumi had become so integral to Viltrumite conquest that many would see his murder as treason against the Empire itself. Do you remember what Mark did? I asked softly. When he found us in the garden? Anissa's expression darkened. I will never forget it. The look in his eyes. She shuddered slightly. I had never seen such rage, such focused hatred. Not even from Thrag at his worst. He didn't say a word, I continued, the memory playing out before me as if it were happening again. He just looked at his father, then at Megumi's body in my arms, then back at his father. And then he moved. None of us could track him, Anissa recalled. Not even me. One moment Nolan was standing there, the next Mark had punched through his chest. Nolan never even had time to look surprised, I said. He just fell. And Mark stood over him, covered in his father's blood, and said, the Empire has a new emperor now, Anissa finished. And no one dared challenge him. Not after what we had just witnessed. Thrag tried, I reminded her. Thrag died, she replied simply. As did anyone else who opposed Mark's ascension. The boy who had been brought to Viltrum as a half-breed curiosity became its absolute ruler in the span of a single day. We fell silent, both lost in memories of that pivotal moment, the day Mark Grayson, barely 17 years old, had seized control of the Viltrumite Empire and begun reshaping it according to the principles Megumi had taught him. I didn't love him the way you did, Eve, Anissa said finally, breaking the silence. But I respected him more than any being I've ever encountered. We all did. Even those who hated what he represented couldn't deny his value. I nodded, a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying lifting slightly from my shoulders. Thank you for your honesty. Always, she replied simply. I walked to the research console adjacent to the viewer, my mind already shifting from reminiscence to action. The molecular energy around my hands intensified as I accessed the secure database containing our analysis of Levy's dimensional portal. I'm not just going to Torlia Prime for the quantum gate, I suddenly announced, my fingers moving swiftly across the holographic interface. I've been studying the dimensional energies since before Mark departed. Anissa moved to my side, her expression curious. I thought Levy was supposed to open a return portal once Mark completed his part of their arrangement. That was the agreement, I confirmed, pulling up complex schematics that filled the air between us with glowing blue equations and molecular diagrams. But I've never trusted Levy. His motivations were always suspect. Convenient that he appeared just when we had been researching dimensional travel ourselves. You think he knew about our interest in alternate realities? Anissa asked. I nodded, expanding one section of the schematics, a complex array of molecular structures that pulsed with simulated energy. Levy's dimensional powers are extraordinary, but his understanding of the underlying principles is limited. He stumbled into his abilities rather than developing them through research. Unlike you, Anissa observed. Precisely, I replied. When he approached Mark with his proposal, a way to potentially find Megumi in another dimension, I insisted on studying his methods. The energy signature he leaves when creating portals is unique, a specific vibrational frequency that corresponds to particular dimensions. Understanding dawned in Anissa's eyes. You've been mapping those frequencies. For months, I confirmed. Every time Levy opened a portal during his demonstrations, I collected data. By the time Mark agreed to his proposal, I had enough information to potentially replicate the process myself. "But you let Mark go through Levy's portal anyway," Anissa said, realization coloring her voice. "As a test subject." I met her gaze without hesitation. As an advanced scout, Mark is more than capable of handling himself in any dimension. And if Levy's intentions proved genuine, all the better. But I wasn't about to risk everything on the word of a dimensional traveler who appeared out of nowhere with an offer too perfect to be coincidental. "And now?" Anissa asked. "Now we have confirmation," I said, gesturing to the frozen image of Megumi on the viewer. "Megumi exists in that dimension. Mark has found him. And the dimensional merger is accelerating, which means we don't have time to wait for Levy to fulfill his end of the bargain, if he ever intended to." I turned back to the console, bringing up another set of calculations. I've been developing my own portal technology, based on Levy's energy signatures, but refined through my molecular manipulation. The equipment at Torlia Prime can amplify these signatures, allowing me to create a stable portal directly to Mark's location. "You're going through yourself," Anissa stated. Not a question but an observation. "Yes," I confirmed without hesitation. The merger doesn't just select randomly which versions remain. It's influenced by proximity, by connection, by intent. Intent. Anissa repeated, her brow furrowing. "Will," I clarified. "Determination. The strength of one's desire to be the version that survives." My hands clenched, pink energy flaring around them. "And I promise you, no version of me in any reality has a stronger will to survive than I do." Anissa studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "When do you plan to attempt this?" "As soon as I reach Torlia Prime," I replied. "The research facility there has the necessary equipment to amplify the energy signatures and stabilize the dimensional bridge. With the right modifications, I can create a portal large enough for all three of us to return through." "All three," Anissa noted. "You, Mark, and Megumi." "Yes," I confirmed, my tone leaving no room for doubt. "All three of us. Together, as we were meant to be." I closed the schematics with a gesture, turning to face her fully. "I need you to prepare the Empire for our return. The dimensional merger will affect our reality as well. We need contingency plans in place for every possible outcome." "Already in progress," Anissa assured me. "I've mobilized the fleet to secure our core systems. If the merger causes significant disruption, we'll be ready to maintain order." "Good," I nodded. "And the Council?" "Divided on how to proceed," she admitted. "Some believe we should attempt to seal our dimension off from the merger entirely. Others argue that's impossible and we should focus on ensuring our reality becomes the dominant one." I considered this. Both approaches have merit. Continue the research into dimensional isolation as a fallback, but prioritize dominance strategies. Our reality, our empire, must be the one that survives. "And if it isn't?" Anissa asked quietly. "If another version becomes dominant?" "Then we adapt," I replied simply. "We find a way to ensure that even if our reality is subsumed, we remain the versions who survive. Mark as Emperor, Megumi returned to us with me at his side. That is non-negotiable." A thought occurred to me suddenly. The other Eve, the one with Megumi now. What do we know about her? Anissa moved to the console, pulling up what limited data we had from Mark's transmissions. "Very little. She appears to have similar molecular manipulation abilities to yours, though the extent isn't clear. She seems protective of him, possibly possessive." "Possessive," I repeated, a cold smile forming. "How charming. She's known him for what, months? Perhaps a year or two at most. And she thinks that gives her some claim to him." I shook my head, the very idea absurd to me. 17 years, Anissa. 17 years I've preserved his memory, his vision, his legacy. 17 years I've built my life around what we created together. What could she possibly offer him that would compare to that level of devotion? "Nothing," Anissa agreed, wisely choosing not to play devil's advocate in this particular conversation. "But she does have one advantage." Which is? She's there with him now, Anissa pointed out gently. While you're here. A temporary situation, I stated sharply, returning to the console to make final adjustments to the portal calculations. Very temporary. I worked in silence for several minutes, fine-tuning the quantum equations that would guide my journey. Anissa remained nearby, watching with the patience of a Viltrumite who had lived for centuries. Did I ever tell you about our first kiss? I asked suddenly, my hands pausing over the interface. Anissa shook her head. You rarely speak of the personal aspects of your relationship. I smiled, the memory washing over me with unexpected clarity. It was after the Centauri campaign. Megumi had developed a strategy that allowed us to conquer the system with minimal casualties on both sides. The celebration feast lasted for days. My fingers traced idle patterns in the air as I spoke, small molecules dancing in response to my unconscious manipulation. He hated the attention, always did. Slipped away from the main hall when no one was watching. No one except me, of course. I always knew where he was. I found him in the observatory, studying the stars as he always did when he needed to think. He didn't turn when I entered, but he knew it was me. Eve, he said, do you ever wonder if we're doing the right thing? I laughed softly at the memory. Such a Megumi question. Always questioning, always examining every decision from all angles. I told him that right and wrong were less important than minimizing suffering. That conquest was inevitable, but cruelty wasn't. He turned to me then, and there was something in his eyes I'd never seen before. That's why I need you, he said. To remind me that even in conquest, there can be compassion. And then he kissed me. Just like that, as if it was the most natural conclusion to our conversation. Anissa smiled, a rare softening of her usually stern features. You balanced each other. His strategy, your compassion. And Mark's strength, I added. The three of us, each bringing something the others needed. It worked. It was perfect. My expression hardened. Until Nolan destroyed it. Not destroyed, Anissa corrected gently. Interrupted. And now perhaps you have a chance to restore it. Yes, I agreed, returning to my work with renewed determination. And nothing, not dimensional barriers, not the laws of physics, and certainly not some alternate version of myself, will prevent that restoration. I completed the final calculations, saving them to a secure data crystal that I slipped into my pocket. The equipment at Torlia Prime should allow me to create a stable portal within 12 hours of arrival. If Levy attempts to interfere. I trailed off, pink energy flaring around my hands. You think he might? Anissa asked. I think Levy's agenda has never been clear, I replied. As I said before, he appeared with exactly the proposal we had been seeking, at exactly the right time. That's either an extraordinary coincidence or a calculated move. To what end? That's what concerns me, I admitted. His interest in Megumi, or rather in the version of him that exists in that dimension, seems too specific. Too targeted. Anissa frowned. You think he knew about Megumi all along? About his existence in another dimension? I think it's a possibility we can't dismiss, I said. Which is why I'm not waiting for Levy to fulfill his end of the bargain. I'm taking matters into my own hands. Eve, Anissa began after a moment of silence, her tone cautious. What if this version of Megumi truly doesn't want to come? If he's built a life there, with that world's version of you he doesn't know what he wants, I interrupted, my voice hardening. He doesn't remember who he is, who we were together. Once he understands, once he remembers, he'll come willingly. And if he doesn't? Anissa pressed, concern evident in her expression. I met her gaze directly, my eyes glowing with pink energy. Then we'll help him remember. By whatever means necessary. The implications hung in the air between us. My willingness to override his autonomy if required, to bring him back regardless of his wishes. But I felt no guilt, no hesitation. How could it be wrong to restore what should never have been taken? To reunite what had been so violently torn apart? My ship will be ready in 30 minutes, Anissa said finally, accepting that my mind was made up. I've assigned our best pilots and a full security detail. I don't need security, I replied. This isn't a military operation. It's a reunion. Nevertheless, Anissa insisted, protocol requires it. And Mark would have my head if I let you travel alone. I conceded the point with a nod. Fine. But they stay with the ship once we reach Torlia Prime. The portal work is delicate. I can't have soldiers disrupting the energy patterns. Agreed, Anissa said. I'll inform the captain. As she turned to leave, I called after her. Anissa. She paused at the doorway, looking back over her shoulder. Thank you, I said simply. For understanding. For supporting this. A rare smile touched her lips. I told you, Eve. I respected him more than any being I've ever encountered. If there's even a chance to bring him back. She shook her head slightly. Let's just say I'm not doing this solely for you and Mark. After she left, I returned to the dimensional viewer, replaying the footage of Megumi Sukuna one more time. Studying his previous transformed appearance against Conquest, before Mark realized who he was, the way he moved, the cadence of his speech. Different, yes, but underneath it all, unmistakably him. I'm coming for you, I whispered to the image. Wait for me, Megumi. Just a little longer. I gathered my research materials and prepared to depart for my ship. The journey to Torlia Prime would take 6 hours at maximum speed. 6 hours of planning, of preparation, of imagining our reunion. As I left the observatory, I paused for one last look at the imperial city spread out below, the gleaming metropolis that stood as testament to Megumi's vision, to what we had built together. The capital of an empire spanning 17 galaxies, all guided by the principles of a human boy who had dared to tell Thrag himself that his conquest strategy was inefficient. Soon, he would see it for himself. Soon, he would remember everything we had been, everything we could be again. Soon we would be together, Mark, Megumi, and me, as we were always meant to be. The universe had given us a second chance, and nothing would stop me from seizing it. Not dimensional barriers, not the laws of physics, not Levy's schemes, and certainly not another version of myself who thought a few months with him gave her any claim to what I had preserved for 17 years. Megumi was mine. Had always been mine. Would always be mine. And heaven help anyone who tried to stand between us. Yuji Itadori awoke to the sterile smell of antiseptic and the soft beeping of medical equipment. His eyes fluttered open, taking in surroundings that were decidedly not the devastated shopping district where he had last been conscious. Instead, he found himself in a medical bay of some kind, white walls, fluorescent lighting, and monitoring equipment surrounding the bed where he lay. The room had the impersonal efficiency of a government facility, with reinforced windows showing glimpses of a city skyline he didn't recognize. He didn't move immediately, simply staring at the ceiling as fragmented memories washed over him. The dimensional shift. Being trapped in his own body as Sukuna took control. The devastation of Shibuya replaying in his mind. People screaming, buildings collapsing. Blood on his hands that wasn't his own but that he'd been powerless to prevent. And then, a four-armed figure with multiple eyes who had somehow expelled the king of curses from his body. His hand moved slowly to his chest where the cursed objects had been forcibly removed. There was no wound, no sign of trauma, just smooth, unbroken skin beneath the medical gown someone had dressed him in. "You're awake," a calm female voice observed from nearby. Yuji turned his head slightly, not startled by the presence. A young woman in traditional Japanese clothing incongruous against the sterile modernity of the room, sat in a chair beside his bed, her expression serene but watchful. "Arome," he said quietly, recognizing her immediately. Not from direct interaction, but from Sukuna's memories that had bled into his consciousness during their unwilling cohabitation. She inclined her head slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing her features. "You know me." "I know pieces," Yuji replied, his voice hollow. When he was in control, I could still see. Still feel. He closed his eyes briefly. "Everything." Understanding dawned in Arome's expression. The connection went both ways, she said. You experienced his actions as your own. Shibuya, Yuji whispered, the single word carrying the weight of countless deaths, countless atrocities committed with his hands but not by his will. I couldn't stop him. I tried, but I couldn't. His voice broke, and he turned his face away, unwilling to let her see the tears that threatened to spill. Arome remained silent, allowing him his moment of grief. When she finally spoke, her voice was measured, clinical. The cursed objects have been contained, she said. Sukuna-sama has ensured they cannot influence you or seek another host. Yuji gave a small bitter laugh, having regained enough awareness unlike when he first resurfaced to understand what he saw. Sukuna, he echoed. The four-armed one. He's different from mine. Yes, Arome confirmed. Though they share an origin, they have walked different paths. Yuji nodded slightly, still not looking at her. I know. I could feel it when he forced my Sukuna out. There was recognition, connection, like looking at a reflection that's somehow become more than you are. He finally turned back to her, his eyes hollow with exhaustion and trauma. Where am I? A secure medical facility within what is called the Global Defense Agency headquarters, Arome replied. Sukuna-sama arranged for your care here while he attends to other matters. The dimensional merger, Yuji said, not a question but a statement. I felt it happening even before I crossed over. Sukuna knew what it was immediately, was excited by it, even. A chance to expand his influence beyond our world. Arome nodded, pouring water from a nearby pitcher into a cup. The barriers between realities are collapsing. Multiple timelines converging into one. She offered him the water, which he accepted after a moment's hesitation. Why are you here? He asked after taking a small sip. With me, I mean. Shouldn't you be at his side? At least, that's what I got from the brief flashes about you. Arome's expression remained impassive, betraying nothing of her thoughts. Sukuna-sama assigned me to ensure your recovery, she replied. I follow his directives precisely. Yuji studied her with tired eyes. Just following orders, then. My duty is to serve Sukuna-sama, she stated simply. That has been my purpose for centuries. She rose, moving to a nearby counter where various medical supplies were arranged. With practiced movements, she began preparing what appeared to be medication. Your body requires nourishment, she explained, her tone professional. The forced separation from the cursed objects has left you weakened. This will help restore your strength. Yuji watched her work, noting the precision of her movements, the careful attention she paid to each step of the process. It was the behavior of someone accustomed to serving, to caring for others with meticulous dedication. You followed him here, he observed quietly. Across dimensions. Itadori Yuji was no fool. He may be one who acts like a goof, but when it matters he can piece many things together, especially the fact that he can see the soul of one unsuited for this world. For he himself is the spiritual son of the first son of heaven. Heaven conceals not from those it deems its own. Arome paused briefly in her work, then continued. Yes. Why? She brought the prepared medicine to him, a clear liquid in a small cup. Because he is my master. I have served him for centuries, through death and rebirth. Yuji accepted the medicine, but didn't drink immediately. That's not an answer. Arome met his gaze, her expression revealing nothing. It is the only answer that matters. Yuji looked down at the medicine, then back at her. Without further question, he drank it, grimacing slightly at the bitter taste. He's different here, Arome said after a moment, taking the empty cup from him. The Sukuna you knew and the one I serve now, they diverged somewhere in their existence. Made different choices. I felt that, Yuji acknowledged, leaning back against the pillows as warmth spread through his body from the medicine. When he forced the fingers out. There was this, I don't know how to really describe it, like a calm purpose behind his power. Direction. He closed his eyes, suddenly overwhelmed by exhaustion. He helped me, he whispered, disbelief coloring his tone. After everything, he actually helped me. Rest now, Arum said, her voice neutral. Your body needs time to recover. Yuji didn't resist as sleep began to claim him again, the medicine working to restore his depleted energy. But before consciousness faded completely, he murmured, "Why did he do it? Why help me?" Arum was silent for so long that Yuji thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was measured, revealing nothing of her own thoughts on the matter. Sukuna-sama's decisions serve his own purposes, she said. It is not my place to question them. Yuji wanted to ask more, to understand what she meant, but darkness was already closing in, pulling him down into dreamless sleep. As his breathing deepened and steadied, Arum remained by his bedside, her expression unreadable as she watched over him. When Yuji awoke again, the quality of light in the room had changed, suggesting several hours had passed. He felt stronger, the medicine having done its work to restore some of his depleted energy. Arum was still there, seated in the same chair, her posture as perfect as before. If she had moved at all during his rest, there was no sign of it. "How long was I asleep?" he asked, his voice clearer than before. 6 hours, she replied. Your body needed the recovery time. Yuji pushed himself into a sitting position, noting with mild surprise that the movement didn't cause the weakness or dizziness he had expected. The medicine is working, Aroma observed. Your natural strength is returning. Yuji nodded, looking down at his hands that had caused so much destruction under Sukuna's control. He flexed his fingers, marveling at the simple fact that they moved according to his will alone. The fingers, he said suddenly, looking up. Where are they? In a secure containment facility within this building, Arome answered. Sukuna-sama ensured they were properly sealed before he departed. Departed? Yuji repeated. Where did he go? Aroma's expression remained neutral, but something in her eyes suggested concern. There have been complications with the dimensional merger. Other entities have crossed over, including another version of himself. Yuji's eyes widened slightly. Another Sukuna? Besides mine? Yes, she confirmed. Yuji absorbed this information, trying to imagine what it would mean for multiple versions of Sukuna to exist in one world. The thought was terrifying. What happens now? He asked after a moment. With me, I mean. Arome rose, moving to a nearby closet and withdrawing fresh clothing, modern attire that would help him blend in with this world. You are free to choose your own path, she said, placing the clothes at the foot of his bed. Though Sukuna-sama suggested you might wish to remain under his protection until the dimensional situation stabilizes. Yuji stared at the clothes, then at Arome, disbelief evident in his expression. Free, he repeated. Just like that. Yes, Arome confirmed. You are not a prisoner here. Yuji shook his head slowly, struggling to reconcile this reality with everything he had experienced. I don't understand. After everything Sukuna did, everything he made me do, why would his counterpart here care what happens to me? Arome seemed to consider her words carefully before answering. Sukuna-sama has evolved since coming to this world. His perspective has broadened in ways I am still coming to understand. She hesitated, then added, and perhaps he recognizes a connection between you. A bond forged through the sharing of a soul, however unwilling that sharing might have been. Yuji looked down at his hands again, remembering all the blood they had spilled under Sukuna's control. I don't know if I can ever move past what he made me do, he said quietly. All those people in Shibuya, their deaths are on my hands. No, Arome said, with unexpected firmness. They are on his. You were as much a victim as they were. Yuji looked up, surprised by the conviction in her voice. You really believe that? I have served Sukuna for centuries, she replied. I know better than most the extent of his power, his will. That you maintained any sense of self at all during his possession is remarkable. And I know better than anyone that he abhors one taking credit for his actions. She moved toward the door, pausing with her hand on the frame. Rest. Change when you feel ready. I will return with food shortly. As she turned to leave, Yuji called after her, Why are you really taking care of me? It can't just be because he ordered you to. Arome paused, her back still to him. For a long moment, she was silent, and Yuji thought she might leave without answering. Sukuna-sama's orders are absolute, she reiterated finally, her voice betraying no emotion. My duty is to fulfill them without question or hesitation. She turned slightly, her profile visible in the harsh fluorescent light. Your recovery serves his purposes. That is all that matters. That's not an answer, Yuji pressed, sensing there was more beneath her carefully controlled response. Arome turned to face him fully, her expression perfectly composed. You share a connection with Sukuna-sama that few beings have ever experienced. That makes you significant, regardless of how that connection was formed. Her eyes met his with cool assessment. In my centuries of service, I have learned that Sukuna-sama's decisions often have multiple layers of purpose. If he wishes you recovered and free, then that is what shall be done. Without another word, she left, closing the door behind her with quiet precision. Yuji stared after her, unsure what to make of the exchange. Arome had revealed nothing of her personal thoughts or feelings, if she even had any beyond her devotion to Sukuna. She remained an enigma, her motivations hidden behind a mask of perfect service. He looked down at the clothes she had left, then at the room around him. A room in a facility he didn't know, in a world that wasn't his own, during a dimensional crisis he barely understood. And yet, despite everything, he felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time, the faintest glimmer of hope. For the first time since accidentally consuming that first cursed object, he was truly alone in his own body. Free. Whatever else this world's Sukuna might be, whatever changes he might have undergone, he had given Yuji something his own version never would have, liberation from the curse that had defined his existence for so long. That, at least, deserved some measure of gratitude. Yuji closed his eyes, allowing himself to feel the simple pleasure of being the sole occupant of his own body. Whatever came next, whatever challenges this merged world might present, he would face them as himself. Just himself. And that was a gift beyond measure. Outside the room, Arome stood perfectly still, her face composed into its customary mask of serene detachment. Her conversation with Yuji had prompted thoughts she rarely allowed herself to entertain. For centuries, her existence had been defined by service to Sukuna-sama. Her purpose, her identity, her very reason for being, all were bound to him with unquestioning devotion. It was a role she had embraced completely, finding satisfaction in the perfect execution of her duties. Yet since arriving in this world, subtle changes had occurred in her master that, by necessity, created corresponding adjustments in her own position. His consideration for others, once non-existent, had expanded. His perspective had broadened. His decisions reflected new priorities that sometimes contradicted his former nature. Caring for Yuji Itadori was one such contradiction, a task that would have been inconceivable to the Sukuna she had first pledged herself to serve. Care for him, Sukuna-sama had instructed before departing, his tone carrying none of the dismissive cruelty that once characterized his commands. Ensure his recovery. His freedom. Freedom. A concept Sukuna-sama had never before considered valuable for anyone but himself. Arome straightened her already perfect posture, centering herself with practiced discipline. These contemplations were unnecessary distractions from her duty. Whatever changes occurred in Sukuna-sama, her role remained the same: perfect service, perfect obedience. If that service now included caring for a young man who had shared a soul with a version of her master, then she would execute that task with the same flawless precision she brought to all her responsibilities. Nothing more. Nothing less. With that clarity restored, Aroma moved purposefully down the corridor toward the facility's kitchen. She would prepare a meal suitable for Yuji's recovery needs, deliver it with appropriate efficiency, and continue to monitor his progress as instructed. Her own thoughts on the matter, whatever they might be, were irrelevant to the execution of her duties. Sukuna-sama had given her a task. She would complete it with perfection. That was all that mattered.
And that concludes this episode. If you enjoyed it, I'd seriously love it if you guys could leave a like on the video, as it genuinely helps out so much, and it keeps me going, plus it takes only 1 second. That said, have a wonderful day. See you in the next one.